Good morning, colleagues. If you could just take your seat. We have been told that there's a few people on a late plane as well, so there'll be a few people joining us late. Welcome everyone to the National Equity Fellows Forum. I'm going to hand over to Gabby, who will just take us through the acknowledgement for country and some housekeeping.
Good morning, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to do the acknowledgement to country. The National Centre and EFIA acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands across Australia upon which we all work and live, and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to pay respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. This is the National Centre's gig today, but I'm just doing a little bit of housekeeping. The emergency exits and bathrooms are very well signed. Out to the corridor behind us are the bathrooms and the emergency exits. All the contact details from the National Centre are here today. For those of you that are here for the EFIA conference, you can register later today. At any time. The registration table will be there all day. And now I'll hand it over to Sue. Thank you.
Thank you. So this year, the National Centre and the Equity Practitioners in Higher Education Australasia, or EFIA, have partnered in order to showcase the outcomes of the 2017 Equity Fellows on the first morning of the conference. And we very much thank Gabby and her team for allowing us to do this. Today, the Equity Fellows will showcase their wonderful projects, and the forum presents us with another opportunity to really be able to share professional insights, experiences and ideas to further establish future strategic directions as we move forward towards our collective goal of developing a more equitable higher education system. And the Equity Fellows program has been central to advancing these objectives, complementing the National Centre's core activities in conducting research, policy and practice to improve access, participation and success for disadvantaged students. Over the past 2 years, we have had the privilege to support 6 wonderful emerging leaders through the National Centre's Australian Government funded Equity Fellows program. Each fellow has conducted targeted, high-profile projects focusing on improving outcomes for individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds. And this leadership in the equity sector has been critical in the development of the national equity narrative. We are working towards this wonderful set of projects contributing to the socially mobile, engaged and more equitable society. And I congratulate the 6 wonderful leaders that we've had. It is important that we develop a very strong national narrative on equity, and that we look forward to the wonderful outcomes from the work that you were here for today. So the Equity Fellows program looks at 4 levels of progress. The program builds leadership in the equity sector, and the fellows have been able to leverage the growth in their information and expertise in the equity field to create fabulous projects that are capable of advancing equity. And we are seeing the emergence of a really passionate group of dedicated equity advocates networked across the education sector. Secondly, the program builds strong relationships with government. The Equity Fellows placement in the department is an important component of their fellowship. And this has been able to give both parties insight and lead to really practical applications. The third component has been the program has increased collaboration between institutions. And we have a really extensive network that's been able to collaborate and cooperate between all the stakeholders, which has been fabulous, looking at policy and program development. And this really helps us work towards that national equity narrative, which we're very proud of. And fourthly, the program sets new and higher standards in research and evaluation because there is a greater transparency and accountability from the work that's being done, creating that evidence base so that we can continue with the improvement of equity outcomes. And the fabulous projects that the Equity Fellows will talk about today have really made valuable contributions to this. And if you've not already had an opportunity to have a look at the 2016 Fellows Equity Reports, they are on our website. So Nadine Zachariah, Kathy Stone and Erica Southgate's projects have really had major impacts because these reports have been able to be disseminated across the sector, both nationally and internationally, through numerous presentations, workshops and seminars. So if you've not had a chance to have a look at these, please do look at them on the website, and you've got that information in your program. One of the key things that shows you the impact of these projects from last year is that we've had over 7,000 downloads of those reports and their materials. And that is just astounding. From 3 people's work, it's been just amazing watching what's happening there. So well done to those 3. Now we're about to hear from the next 3, the 2017 people. Louise Pollard, who's going to talk about remote student participation in higher education. James Smith on the strengthening of the evaluation of Indigenous higher education programs and policies, and Matt Brett on accountability for student equity objectives across the higher education. But just before I call on Louise to come and start, we will have morning tea at 10:30, so we're sticking to our timeline and deadlines, and you will see in your program there extra information and the schedule. And we are then going to run a session that the Equity Fellows have created, looking at shaping the future of Australian higher education equity policy. So this is an opportunity for you to participate in some key questions, looking at research, policy and practice. And in creating Shaping the Future exercise, the Equity Fellows will really recognise the importance of bridging the research, policy and practice together so that each of these inform, and you'll see how well they've put that presentation together. So it's an opportunity for you to contribute to that part of the morning. And then we will break for lunch. The outcome coming from this part of the session will be a communique that we will develop and feed back into the stakeholders group. So I thank you very much for your participation today. We're going to hear from each of the 3 fellows, just a 15-minute presentation. And the first of our fellows, I would like to introduce Louise Pollard.
All right, thank you very much, Sue. The microphone is working, always a good start. Thank you for your kind introduction. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to all elders, past, present and emerging. Good morning. My name is Louise and it is a privilege to be with you here today to talk about my fellowship. As this map shows, we live in a vast and diverse country. And this fellowship aims to highlight remote students, an often neglected group. Remoteness in Australia is defined by access to services, including education and health, and is calculated using a broad range of ABS social and demographic statistics. Here is a visual representation that clearly shows educational disadvantage, highlighted in red across Australia, with blue indicating the most advantaged students in Australia in terms of educational access, performance and outcomes. Children in remote areas are amongst the most educationally disadvantaged in Australia, with a child in a remote area being only 1/3 as likely to go to university as a child born in a major city. Over the year, I've undertaken a range of fellowship activities. I've completed a secondment to the Department of Education and Training, visited Canadian universities and participated in the Canadian Student Services Conference with 2 Associate Fellows, Melinda Mann from Central Queensland University and Nicole Crawford from UTAS, and conducted 3 case studies of Australian universities, all of whom have a relatively high proportion of remote students. The 4th unofficial activity is to evangelise around remoteness, celebrating remote Australia, but also highlighting some of the issues that happen when we put regional and remote into one basket. During my time at the department, I worked with the uni statistics team to break down who our regional and remote students are. The data I'm sharing today is from the 2015 enrolments in Table A universities at all stages of qualifications. It is a summary I've been sharing all year, but I'm keen to recap it first before drilling down further. To set the scene for the next few slides, I have the data represented in 2 ways. Regional and remote numbers are combined, so that's on the right, on your right, and the cohort is then broken down on the other side of the screen. And we've broken it down into inner regional, outer regional, and remote. We can break the remote cohort down even further, but the numbers just get even smaller. So for our purposes today, I'm combining remote with very remote. Of the 200,000 plus students represented by the big yellow circle from regional and remote Australia, remote students only make up just over 9,000 of the cohort. And when reported together, the unique characteristics of this cohort are lost, a trend that you'll see repeated when breaking it down into different characteristics of the cohort. Part-time enrolments. Just over a third of regional remote students study part-time. But when you take out remote, it's over half. It's almost half of the students are part-timers. When looking at gender, generally speaking, females are overrepresented in Australian universities, and this becomes even more apparent the further remote you go. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. Unsurprisingly, there is a high proportion of Indigenous students from remote Australia, which gets lost when regional remote is combined. So it's 9.47 in remote, very remote. When you isolate out very remote, that number increases to just over 15%. But combining remote and very remote together, it's 9.47. But when we combine the 2, it becomes 3% of the cohort. When looking at age, breaking it down into different age brackets, under 20, 20 to 24, so on until over 35, remote students have a significantly different age profile to the other geographical areas, with 43% of the students being over 35 years of age. When looking at socioeconomic status and examining the socioeconomic status of students enrolled in university, the difference between major cities and remote Australia is striking. 42% of students from metropolitan areas are classified as high SES. But in remote Australia, that number is 0.47. Conversely, 12% of students from remote Australia are classified as low SES. But in remote areas, it's over 40%. And looking at online study or external study, over half of the remote cohort is studying externally, compared to 1/3 of the regional and remote cohort combined. For the rest of this presentation, I choose to refer to students who study externally as being online students. But how does this all intersect? Within the remote cohort, when we separate the group into whether they studied internally or online, we end up with 2 quite different profiles. Online student profiles, these are the students who generally remain in the community for study. They're older, they're mature age, they're part-time, and they're overwhelmingly female. When we look at the students who study internally, they're students who will relocate for study. They're younger, so they're school leavers. They're full-time, there's a more even split of gender, and there's a slightly higher Indigenous population. But please note, I'm putting the students into 2 baskets here, into 2 different groups, and this is being generalised. So there are students that don't fit into these 2 groups, but it is an overwhelmingly common scenario. Another important point is that this data is from the 2015 cohort. The 2016 data has just been released, and it now classifies students by their commencing year permanent home address, instead of their home address at the beginning of each year. This means that some students who relocate for study and updated their permanent home address to the one near the uni in 2015 were classified incorrectly. I'm still working through the 2016 data that was released on Wednesday, but it's looking like the undergraduate numbers are closer to 600, as being an extra 600 students will be classified as remote and probably relocating as internal students, but I'm still working through that, but it will be in my final report. There is a significant body of research that investigates participation and support of regional remote students in Australia, with many of the authors being present here today. Through the literature, key challenges are identified as being factors impeding student success, and largely these factors were all supported by the data collected in the case studies. The challenges are summarised in this table and are probably not overly surprising. All of the challenges can be even more overwhelmingly felt by students during their first year at university, where we see even higher rates of students leaving the sector who don't return. One challenge affecting the online students that came up in the interviews but is not overly reflected in the literature is around connectivity, reliable access to the internet. A student I interviewed spoke of getting up at 3 a.m. in the morning. She lived on a remote station, and she had to get up at 3 a.m. just to access the internet for bandwidth reasons. By 8 a.m, the internet was basically non-existent. And do our universities develop strategies to specifically support remote students living remotely to overcome challenges around connectivity? Do we have much in place to support this cohort more broadly? I would argue that we don't, and this needs to change, because this is a growing group of students, as clearly illustrated by this graph. In 2008, there was approximately an even split between online and internal students. But since then, online students from remote areas have increased dramatically. But yet the numbers of students studying internally has remained relatively stable and has even declined slightly. So what can we do to better support this often invisible cohort of students? Invisible in terms of support and invisible in terms of policy. I have decided to frame my response using the equity initiatives maps that were developed in 2015 by Anna Bennett and then refined or reassessed in 2016 by Nadine Zachariah as a part of her fellowship. The equity maps look at effective practice in supporting equity groups across all stages of the student journey, from pre-access through to attainment. I'm now examining the maps through a lens that looks at programs that specifically support remote students, in particular the two profiles, online and relocating. Existing student support and success literature highlights different principles that inform effective student experience models. In analysing the data I've collected, the principles here listed, I believe, are the fundamental in the delivery of effective support for online students. When looking at these 6 principles, I think it is fair to say that there is nothing surprising in the list, but I'm keen to look at how they can be practically considered when applying a remote lens to the map. I've only the time today to provide a quick snapshot, but I'll explore these details, these ideas further in my final report. Know your students. In line with Cathy Stone's fellowship recommendation, having a good understanding of diversity within the cohort is vital, and tailoring activities and programs across the student life cycle to support their needs is important. For example, orientation and first year transition programs are particularly important for remote students, online and relocating. But do we create orientation programs specifically to meet the needs of online students who continue to live in geographical isolated communities? Number 2, collaboration. This includes academic and professional staff working together to bring important skills and concepts that traditionally sit in co-curricular activities into the classroom. Sally Kift, among others, often talks about this, and it is important as many remote students are significantly time poor and don't have the time or resources to engage in activities outside the classroom. Another example of collaboration that governments can potentially consider is to work with local remote organisations to create study hubs in the community where students can go to access resources and support. We could potentially utilise our schools more to help facilitate this, employing teachers after school hours to support and provide prospective and current students with the support and resources to provide to help them make decisions regarding university and careers. Students who live in towns where there are community resource centres often spoke about the value they gave them in helping create a sense of community outside of their virtual classroom. Conversely, students who didn't have access to such centres spoke of only realising people in their town were studying the same course when they went to the exam. Celebrating remote Australia. This is an important concept that I feel could be developed further in our universities, in the classroom and through co-curricular activities. Support across the student life cycle. As we know, many of the students leaving university are not doing so by choice, and it is important that as a sector we consider how to re-engage these students. This has been done really effectively across universities in Canada, as we saw in our study tour, but it would be worthwhile considering for the benefit of remote students and the broader student community. Policies that recognise geographical disadvantage. Of the school leavers interviewed, the majority spoke about the importance and impact university outreach programs had on the university aspirations and transition. Yet department programs such as HEP do not recognise the cost of providing outreach to remote communities, and remote communities are costly to engage. It is more expensive for me to travel to Kununurra in northern Western Australia than it is for me to travel to Hawaii. We need to invest more in remote communities and their students. And secondly, we need to put in place university-wide policies that stipulate accommodations for students who experience significant internet challenges associated with living in remote Australia. From what I've seen, it is currently left to students being supported by understanding and empathetic staff. One lecturer I interviewed spoke of sending out 3G internet dongles to students affected by internet outages. Another had printed out the materials and posted them out. However, one student was also told that if they received assistance, it would be an unfair advantage to others in the class. And this student no longer asked for help. Number 6, financial support. Requiring financial support for this cohort is unsurprising, considering it's a massively important consideration for prospective and current students from remote Australia. For example, online students spoke of the significant costs involved in participating in intensive units for their course. Access to grants to cover costs of transport and living expenses while students complete these often compulsory courses would remove some of the potential barriers they face in accessing these units. These are but a few of the ways in which our universities and the government can better support student success for students from remote Australia. It is also important to note that in this fellowship, the students engaged were those deemed likely to succeed, as they are in the latter years of their study. We explored university strategies that they had accessed and that they felt supported or enriched their uni experience. The voice not represented in the data is from students who didn't make it into the university or didn't make it through their first year. And I'm very aware that this is a missing part of the picture where we need to focus attention. Education has the power to transform lives. And in Australia, in the 21st century, all students, regardless of where they lived, should be encouraged to pursue their educational goals. I have a massive list of people to thank, as my fellowship has been an amazing opportunity and it's not a journey I've travelled through alone. I've been fortunate to be on this journey with my fellow fellows, Matt Brett and James Smith, and I thank them, along with last year's fellows, for their constant support and encouragement. I'm grateful for the support provided by my advisory group, many of whom are here today. And I am also super appreciative of the guidance and encouragement provided by my supervisor, Grady Venville, and mentor, Judy Skeen. Thank you also to Melinda Mann and Nicole Crawford for being my travel buddies and for your continued support in the project. Thank you to my colleagues from Student Experience at UWA, especially to the teams in Equity Outreach who always have my back. Finally, thank you to the staff from the National Centre and the Department of Education for this opportunity and for your help this year. It has been a challenging yet rewarding way to spend 2017. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Okay, were there any questions just while... was there a question? Yes, John?
Yeah, hi. Thanks. Excellent. I'm just wondering whether other countries, you've been to Canada, and I'm thinking of the Open University system in the UK. I mean, how feasible is it, given the remoteness and the disparate nature of our students? Wouldn't you be better off concentrating by having one or say three universities or institutions that basically they are the remote university providers, hence they can then put in the effort that obviously has been lacking to some extent because it's more costly, etc. What happens in Canada or?
In Canada, what I saw was that they didn't necessarily have a lot of support that was tailored to remote students. They didn't really even recognise some of the different, some of the equity or the differences within their Canadian student population. But it's quite different over there because it's done at a state level. So universities are managed at a state level, so I really saw differences. We went to universities in British Columbia as well as Alberta. So I saw quite a lot of differences between there. They've taken more that model where they've got one university of Athabasca, which supports online students across the whole country. I'm not a massive fan of just pointing it out to one or two or three institutions. I think students should have choice, freedom of choice, freedom to choose the university that they want to go to. Athabasca, it was definitely, Melinda and Nicole would, I think, agree, the poor cousin of the universities up there. They didn't have the power, they didn't have the lobby base, and they didn't have that voice or the resources. So that's just the Athabasca University, and they were very aware of it. In Australia, I think if we have strategies in place to support the most disadvantaged or the most marginalised, all the other student equity groups or all the other groups in place would benefit as well. So I just think it's good practice. Kathy talks about it a lot, just good practice about how we should create these virtual classrooms for online students. We should have in place accommodations for internet when it goes down. Yeah, I would much rather go more that model instead of just having one or two or three institutions. That's my personal preference. Andrew?
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed that too. I looked at some work out of the UK a couple of years ago, which found similar to Australia probably, that the outreach was very London-centric, the Aim Higher program. And obviously HEP has probably been similar, although there's been constant efforts, particularly through the collaborations in Queensland and New South Wales to try to cover the whole state. We have a regional loading which supports the cost of provision of campuses, but doesn't necessarily support students, particularly remote students. So what do you think in a policy sense is should we have a remote loading that's more applicable, that's more student-centric perhaps, in addition to a regional loading, or have you thought about maybe some policy implications that the government could throw some money towards supporting remote students rather than just regional campuses?
I think we definitely need to do more recognising that the challenges to remote students are not necessarily the same as regional. For example, but I think like looking at outreach, I definitely think there should be extra loading to recognise the challenges engaging remote communities. That was the space I used to work in at UWA. To look at support when they're at university, I think we need to break it down even further, looking at support for creating the curriculum for online students where they don't necessarily have access, but also creating like study hubs. So I do think we need to tailor the policy more specifically to that cohort instead of relying, does that answer your question in a single sentence?
Thank you very much. There'll be an opportunity to ask more questions at the end. I'd like to thank Louise and welcome James Smith.
Okay, thank you very much, Sue, and I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, past, present and emerging. Today I'll be talking around the Equity Fellow project that I've been involved with, which has been around strengthening evaluation in Indigenous higher education contexts across Australia. And I would like to firstly acknowledge my colleagues, Kelly Pollard, Kim Robertson and Fiona Shalley, that have been integral to the piece of work that we've done. We've approached that in a more collaborative sense to be able to get access to different data points, to have a look and I guess engage with the data in different ways. To start off with though, what do we know about Indigenous higher education in Australia? Well, we know within the VET context in certificate level courses, by and large, we're sitting at parity in terms of enrolments and participation. But then when we go into higher education, as you can see by this graph here, when we move to advanced diploma, bachelor degree, and then into postgrad space, we see far less participation. That being said, we have seen an upward trend over the last 10 years in terms of participation Indigenous participation in higher education. But then if we take a closer look at the cohort study conducted by the Department of Education and Training, what you'll see is this bottom one in particular is really important, is that in terms of completions, we're seeing only less than 50% getting through at the other end. So we know that we've got a positive story. We are starting to see an increase, but we're not seeing the completions necessarily. This means that we've got to be astute around the way that we're evaluating what we're doing in this space, and I guess that's what I've looked at across the last year. There are a few different factors and things that I've been looking at. So there has been consistent reports around increasing high quality evaluations within the Indigenous evaluation space, and I thought I'll start off with the Indigenous evaluation space and I'll move towards the Indigenous higher education space. In terms of Indigenous evaluation broadly, in Australia, high quality evaluations, the Productivity Commission has mentioned this, Sarah Hudson's work from the Centre for Independent Studies, and the Australian National Audit Office have repeatedly said that we need to improve in this space. There's also some scholarship around integrating Indigenous and Western knowledge systems in this space. Generally driven within more of a research context than an evaluation context, but the Australasian Evaluation Society has increasingly been having discussions around that. Indigenous scholarship has also emphasised the importance of decolonising or Indigenous research methods and data sovereignty, two separate concepts but very important. So data sovereignty very much around the ownership, the leadership, the control of how data is used and how decisions are made about that data, how that's reflected. And obviously the Indigenous research method stuff is self-explanatory, but again hasn't been applied within the evaluation space as much as it has within the research context. If we shift towards Indigenous higher education, if we go back to the Burk Review from 2012, one of the clear statements in that was while considerable data was available through departmental program-based reporting to monitor progress, there was not always sufficient evidence to assess the overall success or otherwise of specific programs. In some cases, there were no independent evaluations of programs for the panel to draw on. So going back 5 years ago to the Burk Review, they were actually struggling to find the evidence to inform some of the recommendations. They ended up going to a lot of expert opinion in terms of making the recommendations that they did. And it probably comes as no surprise then that one of their recommendations was the development of an Indigenous higher education monitoring and evaluation framework. I do want to point out the work that Aileen Morton-Robinson and colleagues have done around On Stony Ground, which was in relation to the Burk Review at the time, and that was doing a comparison across universities around the importance of Indigenous governance and participation and what was happening, and that's probably the first decent attempt that we've seen to try and do some comparative work across universities in Australia in that space. We've also seen a number of National Priority Pool grants through HEP that have been supporting building an evidence base in that space, and this book here is an example of one of those. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Higher Education Advisory Council, ATSI-HEAC, before that was abolished under the current government, recommended the development of an Indigenous higher education performance framework. And if we go back to this slide down the bottom here, this is from the Indigenous Advancement Strategy Evaluation Framework that's just been released. And you'll start to see here that concepts such as performance and evaluation in a policy space are starting to be separated out. It's important, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on. So where has all of this led? Well, as I've said, I've been investigating ways to strengthen evaluation in Indigenous higher education programs and policies across Australia, and I've mentioned the research team already. It's also been underpinned by an expert project advisory group. I won't acknowledge them all, but all of these people have been critical to the success in providing feedback throughout the Equity Fellow process. And it's included government representation and representation from ATSI-HEAC there as well. So an overview, these are the various things that I've done. It's been a very busy year. It's included the secondments, it's included a trip overseas, it's included doing some research interviews. Today I'm going to be focusing on the highlighted blue bits, the 24 interviews with Indigenous scholars thinkers in the higher education sector across Australia, and there's some conceptual model development as well. In terms of the participant pool, now I'm not going to be presenting the empirical, their statements, their voices, but I am going to be presenting their coding, the coding that I've done against that today and some of the discourses that have emerged through that, and that's purely a time frame issue for today. But in terms of who we know, 24 participants, 2 inclusion criteria, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and working in a senior Indigenous focus role within a higher education institution. Range of roles from Deputy Vice-Chancellor, strategist, researcher, manager, director, so that's included both academic but also professional staff within that. These next 2 dot points are critically important, and whilst it's not for the full cohort, I'm only presenting that for the information that I've got. Average time working in the education sector, 20 plus years, about 20 and a half years. Average time working in the higher education sector, 17 years. These are people that are very experienced, that have given their life, their passion, their heart to the work that they do, and that's actually really important within the Indigenous context that I'm speaking about. Whilst it's not necessarily representative, I have had participants from all states and territories as well, which was actually quite an important component. There were diversity in preferences between the participants to remain anonymous versus those wanting attribution, and largely that aligns to contemporary discussions around data sovereignty and owning what is said and so forth. And importantly, multiple language groups and regions across Australia as well. So some of the emerging themes. Evaluation, not surprisingly, has been defined very broadly. I didn't go in defining that, I wanted that to come out of the data. The terms down the left-hand side are terms the participants have used when I've been coding. Something of interest though is that reporting in particular came out number 1, and it was usually mentioned in terms of funding, and it was a real key driver for evaluation in this landscape. So we can't underestimate the importance of funding in terms of what is currently being evaluated. Impact and outcomes are deemed to be important, so that's part of the policy narrative nationally at the moment. The Australian government are talking a lot around impact and outcomes and accountability, but that also came through in participant voices as well. Not surprisingly, strength-based evaluation, so moving away from a deficit discourse which pervades Indigenous affairs nationally, not just in the higher education space, and looking at that from a more strengths base. And importantly, and this is on the next slide, acknowledging that different types of evaluation approaches rely on different types of data. So what does that mean? Well, another theme was around reconceptualizing data in Indigenous higher education context. Now you'll see that I've done some colour coding over there in terms of the coding. The blue coding is particularly important, and there are 2 elements to that. One is around the Indigenous methods, Indigenous knowledges, data sovereignty, and the other component of that is, well, what does that mean when we start to use and think about those things? And it means that we bring a greater level of integrity and legitimacy to what is being reported on or evaluated. It means that we're analysing and interpreting differently, and it means that we're using that data. The quantitative and the qualitative data, again, not surprisingly, they were mentioned often hand in hand, and the common discourse there was that quantitative data is important, but only if it's with the qualitative data that provides the context. And there was a real narrative around context, and that is absolutely fundamental, but it's actually frequently ignored both by universities and government in terms of the way that evaluation reporting and or government funding reporting is approached at the moment. Indigenous engagement with an analysis I've mentioned already, and this was another important narrative which kind of came as a surprise to me, and that's that non-Indigenous people can play a role in Indigenous evaluation, but data generated must be viewed from Indigenous worldviews. So they're saying, no, it's fine, we're quite happy to work collaboratively with our non-Indigenous peers, but when it comes to the decision making around how that data's used, please speak to us, please bring us into that conversation, because we will have potentially a different view to non-Indigenous researchers and evaluators. Another emerging theme was towards greater accountability. Now, those two top ones on the left-hand side of universities of government, as I was coding that, it was flipping. It would go from one to the other in terms of what was most important. They came out equal on top. And actually that surprised me. I was expecting the sector to talk about accountability of government and see that, but actually universities, this focus on universities was equally important as well. Down from that vice-chancellors and executives holding them accountable. That fourth one is really important, and that was an accountability back to community, and something that they felt that universities and government often forget about as well, but is absolutely key to particularly the senior Indigenous positions that I'm talking about that have relationships with local communities. And that those Indigenous staff often have cultural accountability. And sorry, and just going back to that, I know that Matt's going to be talking much more about accountability in the next presentation, so I won't go into that in too much detail. Here again, I've done some colour coding, and as you can see, a lot of the discussion around drivers of evaluation was around who had control of different elements of those drivers of evaluation. The blue is Indigenous control, black government control, and green university control. Now that's perhaps not entirely accurate because it's much messier than that, but really what this shows us is that there is a really uneasy nexus at the moment around the drivers of evaluation and who has control. And we've got to start to grapple with that and look at that interplay and say, well, how can we actually make that a less uneasy nexus? How can we start to collaborate? How can we start to think about these things in a more collaborative sense? So what does all this mean? Well, I've done some initial work in trying to pull this together. Now, don't worry about this. We'll see that in the next few slides broken down a little bit. But generally speaking, what we've tried to do is create a model here that's not just about the students, but that's looking at that broader macro context, looking at family and community, looking at schools and organisations, and looking at the university and some of the system levers as well. But you will see that students are at the centre, and that was part of the narrative. If we have a look at some of these performance measures of sorts, and I do use that term loosely because some of them are what we would typically call performance measures. Some talk in more vague terms around perhaps the nature or effectiveness that fits more within a qualitative realm, and some you'll actually find are more methodological. The blue bits highlighted here are ones that we are currently reporting on. So for those in particular through the Indigenous Student Success Program at the moment. I've mentioned that students need to stay at the centre. We know that Australia collects reasonably good data in terms of numerical data on student outcomes, but it's not as good at collecting qualitative data to marry up with that, to provide that contextual information. That being said, some universities are quite good at doing this. It's just that they're not reporting on that at the moment. So it's invisible to government and it's visible to them, and it's being used for strategy development. Financial stress, as I think Louise mentioned in her presentation, we've got loads of research scholarship that says that this is a really important thing, but we're still not collecting really good data about that. Or if we do collect it, it's collected in places where it's not joined up. So we need to be bringing that data in from different departments to be able to tell that picture much better than we can. And there's certainly scope to have more sophisticated ways in identity in terms of identifying for indigeneity and also language use. And I know Fiona is better with the statistical side of things to talk about that if people want to come up in the break. But certainly some of the work that was going on in Canada when I was there was quite impressive in that space. If we move to family and community, again, not a lot of work happening in this space. We're poor at collecting data about community and elder engagement in particular, yet we know that the research says that this is a really important space, and certainly our research participants spoke about that. This one that's highlighted here, in terms of the number, quality and effectiveness of community and family engagement activities, there is some really interesting reporting through HEP and some of the outreach projects in particular through HEP that haven't been analysed. There's been no meta-analysis of some of that work, but there's certainly some interesting stories and narratives within that I think could be explored further. The other thing that you will find is that much of the qualitative data in this space is very descriptive, and it's not actually looking at impact for either Indigenous or non-Indigenous participants. And when I say non-Indigenous, that's around building the cultural capacity within this space, including university staff, to be able to engage with staff, with families and communities. Schools and organisations, by and large, we're not connecting data very well at all in that space. It's not that it's not being collected, certainly in the school space there is, but if you drop down to the last point around strong calls for longitudinal and cohort studies to track students from school through to higher education and employment, at the moment we're not doing that. So starting at the early years, working through primary, secondary and then higher education and then into employment. But recognising also that it's not that neat, that for many Indigenous students there are multiple entry and exit points along that journey. Similarly, partnership activities in this space are also often very descriptive and not focused around effectiveness. And similarly with outreach work, there's been an increase in outreach work but a significant lack of impact and outcome evaluation. And universities, what do we know in this space? This is an interesting space, and I often talk about this as sort of the system lever space, if you like, or the enabling space in terms of what universities can do. What you'll see here, the blue one and the green ones are performance measures that are being measured either through ISSP or are likely to be measured through the University's Australia Indigenous strategy moving forward. And there's some reporting framework work that's happening at the moment with Universities Australia to move that forward, and I've been liaising with them in and through NATSI as well as part of that. So we know that universities are reporting against Indigenous governance, education and workforce, but that it's new and that will need to be looked at and refined over time. We know that it's difficult to measure impact and outcomes in some vital areas, and one that came up time and time again, going back to the fact that many of the people who've worked in the system for 17 years on average, is the influence that they have had. How do you measure the influence of an individual or a group of people that has stayed committed to a university over a long period of time? We're not particularly good at doing that. We're not particularly good at celebrating that either. But also other concepts such as cultural safety / cultural competency and the incorporation of Indigenous knowledges. These are things that we're hearing that are important, but that we actually haven't got good tangible ways to measure yet. And obviously the evaluating system levers is a hard space, and there needs to be some conversation. So to finish off with a few propositions, I've got 10, 5 on this slide, 5 on the next slide. The first one by and large is saying we need to understand why an Indigenous higher education monitoring and evaluation / performance framework hasn't been implemented. It's been called for from the sector on 2 occasions, repeatedly from particularly NATSI and others, but there has been no tangible action in that space. So let's focus in and hone in on that, what can be done. The next one is to have a national conversation about it. A number of the Indigenous leaders and scholars and thinkers that I spoke to reinforced that we need to have a strategic discussion about this. This isn't just about coming together and sharing stories about what's working and what's not, although that's good and important. But we need to have a strategic conversation around what we're going to measure, how we're going to measure it and why. And there's a sense that that hasn't been done, and there's a sense that there hasn't been the opportunity in Australia to do that for a number of years as well, with some of the traditional governance structures waning. Understanding that stories and narratives provide a culturally relevant source of evidence for evaluating the impact and outcome of Indigenous higher education. That's a no-brainer really. We need to be listening and recognising that metaphors are often used in that sense as well. Reporting processes that accommodate qualitative data, such as narrative stories and case studies, and which complement existing quantitative data reporting processes. And they need to move beyond descriptive accounts, and they need not to be boxed in by word limits within reporting templates. Which was a constant complaint. Yeah, well, that's fine, we can provide the narrative, but we've got 400 words to do that in, and actually the story that we want to tell for multiple students is much more important than that. And consideration of innovative qualitative evaluation strategies aligned with Indigenous methodologies and methods could provide new insights suitable for reforming that. We can learn a lot from what's happening in the research space and apply that to the evaluation space, I think. We're starting to see a groundswell in that space. Australia's been very engaged and active in that. We've got NIRICN, the National Indigenous Research and Knowledges Network, that's been doing a lot of work in that space as well. And to finish up the last 5, student enrolment success and completion data is an important measure, but there are broader systemic considerations within community, school and university contexts that also need to be considered. So while we do need to keep students at the centre, we've got to think about that broader macro context in which they operate or which they engage with universities. Accountability needs to be viewed as a shared responsibility between universities and government, and with the community as the focal point in such discussions. So remembering that we're accountable to community, and the 2 major areas that are accountable to them are universities and government, and to work together. Consideration should be given about embracing cultural standards into texts or accreditation requirements. This has been an interesting one, and I haven't gone into it today, but there has been a lot of discussion about trying to align a lot of the thinking around Indigenous whole-of-university approaches with TEXA, and I know that NATSIHEC have been doing some work about that separately as well, but it seems, at least preliminary findings of both NATSIHEC and myself are aligning very strongly there and saying that we need to think about that, particularly in terms of cultural standards. And the World Indigenous Nations Higher Education Consortium has done a lot of work in that space where they've got their own accreditation system set up. There's only 2 institutions in Australia that have that, Wallatuka Institute at a program level and Bachelor Institute at an institutional level. Drivers of evaluation in Indigenous higher education involve a complex and often uneasy interplay, as I mentioned before, between Indigenous, government and university control, and that we've got to start playing with that and thinking about the mechanisms to make that work better. And importantly, I really want to emphasise this last one, that the Australian higher education sector has the necessary Indigenous capability and leadership to drive this agenda globally. So whilst we often look to New Zealand and Canada, and they are doing some brilliant work, we're actually doing some pretty good work in this space ourselves, and we've got a lot of Indigenous leadership and a lot of Indigenous thinkers and scholars that are doing work in this space, and we need to work with them to be the global leaders in this space. We can be, we should be. Thank you.
Okay, 2 burning questions. John.
Thanks, James. Interesting and stimulating presentation. My question is really about the performance measures that you've listed up on the screen. And they all seem to be very much focused on success and the positive aspects of completions and so on. What about failure and the aspects of why we've had Louise talk about the voice of those who hadn't been able to succeed? What about measurements associated with failure?
There's probably a couple of different components to that question. One is that notion of failure equating to deficit, and that was something that came through the interviews in particular, was that actually we don't want to keep looking at the failures and hear the bad stories. We want to look at the positive and hone in on that and invest in that. That being said, there was still a counter-narrative to that, if you like, that was around, we know that we're not doing well and that we need to get better, and we've got to learn from what we're not doing well as well. So I think particularly the qualitative measures around nature and effectiveness, they don't necessarily need to always tell a positive story. They can tell can bring that context into the discussion, a bit like Louise was saying earlier with the remote students about telling that story. What are the challenges and how do we change those challenges into opportunities? So switching the narrative but not ignoring it. Yep. Hey, thanks.
Hi, I'm Louise Watson. Thanks, James. I do agree with you about the need for a more complex evaluation framework that reflects the complexity of Indigenous student experience. My common question is also about the data. You say we currently have reasonable data collected on enrolment success and completion, but I would suspect in an Indigenous context those are very narrow measures, as is the measure of failure, which is simply not completing.
Yep. Absolutely.
And is there any way that could be, you can see that those broader measures being incorporated?
Absolutely, and for me I think that comes back to the conversation around combining the quantitative and qualitative. So the quantitative, by and large, yes, we have got some measures, but yes, they are quite narrow. But if we start thinking about those with the qualitative measures, we can change that narrative, we can change the meaning behind that data and how it's used. And there has been a significant increase in research, not so much in the evaluation space, but in research space around looking at Indigenous success stories in higher education. We're starting to see that. I'm involved in an OLT grant at the moment in that space. I've been seeing a lot more work in that space, and universities are using that in a lot of their social marketing work as well. Now, the success story of their students, and that they've come in, they struggled, and this is where they are now, and this is the employment opportunities that they've had. And similarly, alumni as well, bringing alumni back in and engaging with the university. But we've got to get more sophisticated in the way that we do that at the moment, and we're not. We're just being driven really by the reporting at the moment, and the reporting by and large is interested in the quant. So until the reporting format structure changes to embed qualitative more strongly in a real way in terms of impact and outcomes, we're unlikely to see that narrative change in a significant way.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
James. So we now welcome Matt Brett, who's going to give us his presentation of the third of the fellows in equity, performance and accountability. Thank you, Matt.
Okay. Thank you for all you being here today. It's great to be here. It's been a great year with this fellowship. And I'll just kind of start off with that's got a challenge that sort of emerged at the start of this fellowship. I did a Google search at the very start and said, okay, equity, performance and accountability, higher education. And in the academic literature, 0 results. And in Google, there was 4 hits, and they were all media references to the announcement of this fellowship, which to my mind was kind of exciting and terrifying at the same time. Exciting, it's like I'm breaking new ground here, I'm doing something that no one's ever done before. Terrifying, it's like, surely someone's come up with something like this before. Is this some kind of category error where I'm kind of totally misreading the field? Or sharper minds turned their mind to this and rejected this kind of idea. So that's where I started off with this fellowship, this kind of quandary. And even though this kind of phrasing or this kind of slogan hasn't been used extensively in higher education, there is a very rich tradition of research into equity and in higher education and in performance and accountability, and that's where I'll start off. I'm particularly attracted to this quote here, and it's been a kind of conceptual reference point all the way through the fellowship. This is from Joseph Burk, who's written extensively on these issues, particularly in the United States. And in this book chapter, The Many Faces of Accountability, he asks, who is accountable to whom, for what purposes, for whose benefit, by which means and with what consequences? And he calls this question deceptively simple but devilishly difficult. And I think if you overlay an equity dimension to this, and as we've seen with James and Louise, the complexity associated with a single group is quite rich. You start to try and jumble all these kind of concepts together into one, you can find yourself going slightly mad, which I've managed to avoid for the most part through the course of this year. But there are indeed many faces of accountability for equity in Australian higher education. And I don't want to play a game of spot the logo just here, but you'll see I've got political parties, I've got the department, I've got universities, I've got non-universities and various kind of elements that are kind of all wrapped up together in the system. And part of the challenge that I've set myself through this fellowship is to try and make sense of this at a system level. I kind of accept that that there is a lot of nuance and a lot of depth associated with specific elements of equity, and we've kind of seen that with James and Louise's presentations just recently. I've unashamedly have tried to avoid that kind of detail, and I think that's both the strength and the weakness of the fellowship that I've gone through. But I'm trying to look at this from a kind of systems view related to that accountability question. So through the course of the fellowship, I've been sort of examining these issues at a system level, and this is a snapshot of equity and accountability across the system. So in the table, you'll recognise the standard equity groups, plus a few others thrown in for good measure. And that list could be much longer if I were to produce the full list of every group that's referenced, more or less in line with the university's equity values across the system. But I've just added two down the bottom of the table with first and family and LGBTI kind of issues, just to sort of make a point. And what we see with a policy side of things, or a government kind of aspect of performance and accountability, is that there is a big coordination challenge. The groups that we prioritise, and we have prioritised since the publication of Higher Education, a white paper and a Fair Chance for All, they're still there. We don't spend money on all of those groups. Some groups have some resources allocated, some do not. And if we look at other elements of government policy, particularly the Student Experience Survey and QUILT, we'll find that some groups are referenced, others are not, and they throw in some other groups for good measure as well. So there's a kind of coordination challenge within government, which from an accountability perspective, it's not a kind of clear transition from objective to resourcing to accountability and evaluation. Now that challenge is even bigger when you take a look at what's happening at universities as well. So I've got up on there references to the specific groups within the strategic plans of universities, and also empirical data around the performance of these groups within universities' annual reports. And the thing that kind of jumps out from there is that in some cases we are prioritising things that we're not reporting on. In other cases we're reporting on things that we haven't prioritised. So there's a kind of disconnect there in some ways. And if you put that together with the coordination challenges of government, we've got I wouldn't say we've got a broken system in terms of accountability, but we've certainly got room for improvement. In terms of trying to think about why do we have this kind of disconnect, why do we have this coordination challenge, there are obviously many kind of drivers for that. But the driver that I've been exploring in more depth is the issue of universal participation and the inability of the system to adjust its policies around higher education generally, and financing and equity policy for the transition to universal participation that we're making. And lo and behold, in the last census, the data's come out this year, we find that recent school leavers, 51.4% of recent school leavers, people aged 18 and 19 years of age, are participating in tertiary education. And that's tertiary, it's not higher education, but if one looks at higher education, that's about 42% of the population that are going through to higher ed. And if you roll through the coming years as more and more students enter the system as mature age students, we'll find that they will hit universal higher education as well, in my opinion. So universal participation is here. It sort of means the kind of demand-driven funding has done its job in some ways, and pretty much anyone that wants to participate can. And within the cohort, we find that under the current equity groups, so low SES, regional, remote, disability, Indigenous, movement in non-traditional areas, I think NESB as well, 50% of undergraduate students fall into one of those equity groups. So we've got universal participation and pretty much close to universal equity participation within that. So equity is kind of a core part of the furniture for the system. Have we adjusted our thinking? Have we adjusted our groups? Have we adjusted the prioritisation of policy to accommodate this kind of change that we've seen in participation? And my feeling is no, and that's part of the challenge that we face. And it kind of leads to some specific kind of equity kind of challenges as well. And what I have up here is a kind of statement which I think is perhaps provocative, that equity is ubiquitous, it's 50% of the sector, but it's peripheral. No one cares about it. And that's probably an overstatement in some ways, but I think that in justifying that assertion, one thing that I've done is to survey people across the sector and interview a number of sort of experts across the sector. And in both cases, through the surveys and the interviews, a high proportion of people just weren't prepared to make an estimate at all to this question. Please estimate, kind of fairly safe way. This wasn't a very kind of torturous kind of question. Please estimate how much money do you think we're spending on this kind of equity objective in kind of vaguely described terms, and half of the people said no idea. Wouldn't hazard a guess. Those that did estimate or provide an estimate, the mean estimate for the interviews at least was 2.7%. So it's a small proportion of university kind of resourcing. I would just add to that many people came back to me and said, well, do you mean direct funding or indirect funding? And I sort of left it up to them. You decide what kind of definition you're using. So I just want to put that out there, that some people did kind of recognise that there was other elements to the funding that needs to be recognised as well, not just the small supplemental kind of funding. But nonetheless, it's a small percentage, 2.7%. And if you juxtapose that with the 50% of students that are participating in the system that are from an equity group, it's kind of it's hard to kind of reconcile in some ways. The other thing I'll kind of add with that is that the 2.7% is kind of more or less in line with the 4% that was recommended in the Bradley review of resources going towards student support and outreach. So in some ways, one might ask whether people are just sort of using that as a reference point to sort of guide their thinking about these kind of issues. But nonetheless, I think there is a kind of, combined with the accountability snapshot and the kind of estimates that people are kind of linking to the resourcing of equity, there's a kind of issue there that needs to be addressed, and we need a better way of being able to deal with that. And that's where the fellowship comes in, this kind of 4 hits of Google of equity, performance and accountability. Now, drawing some inspiration from Joseph Burk and the trying to come up with something that was deceptively simple but devilishly difficult, I've come up with 3 very simple goals. One is to be really clear about what our objectives are. And I think the slide earlier with that equity kind of snapshot, one could say, well, we've got very clear policies in government around the groups that we're participating, or the groups that we're prioritising. We just need to find better ways of aligning the system along those lines. But on the other hand, we've got a third of universities that are not providing empirical data on sort of LGBTI participation, but are providing very rich qualitative data on that group as a way of expressing their equity values within their university. We need to find a way of being able to reconcile that and recognise that we do have some disconnect in terms of the extent to which university activity and government policies are sort of overlapping and interacting with each other. The next is, once we've got some clear objectives in mind for equity, we just need to embed that within the system. We need to embed that across the higher education system, not just in sort of little snippets of the system. And we need to be transparent. We need to be really clear about what the objective is, about how much money is associated with it, and how we're tracking in performance terms. And the details for this, once you delve down into specific groups, will become much more complicated in various ways, but at a high level, I think 3 very simple but deceptively difficult sort of questions in some ways. So the next few slides, I'm just going to provide a little bit of kind of light and shade around what some of the interviews were saying about these kind of 3 themes, just to sort of highlight that I'm not making this up. There is some kind of substance to this, and I'll wrap it up with returning back to the framework after that. So the first one, in terms of clear objectives, I've asked questions around through surveys and through interviews, what do you mean by the equity objectives? What do you understand them to be? And people have come back in various ways with a question around, well, what do you mean by that? What's your interpretation of the question? And I think one response in some ways kind of really sums up the difficulty we have from a theoretical and a philosophical sense around these kind of issues, in that equity is a loaded term. It means different things to different people, and it makes it really hard to come up with a kind of grand unifying objective that's going to be able to reconcile the different patterns of prioritisation across the sector overall. It assumes a moral framework, but it articulates none. And many people came back to me and said, what do you mean? So I think that trend in some ways, or that kind of feature of the qualitative interviews, I think is something that we just need to embrace in some ways, and say we need to work a little bit harder to get some consensus around what we mean by this. I've got a quote here from a Vice-Chancellor that was sort of saying, the groups were prioritised a couple of decades ago. We're in the 21st century now, and we need to do something a little bit different. We need to be thinking about issues of colour and ethnicity and religion and other issues as well. We don't collect that data as part of the higher education data collection very well. Whilst it's legitimate that we need to find some ways of sort of sharpening the focus of our policy. This is a powerful, influential figure within the sector sort of saying we need to broaden out. This is something we need to find ways of being able to integrate within our overall equity framework for Australian higher education. This quote I think is particularly useful as well because it kind of highlights that we shouldn't wait to get these objectives sorted before we do anything else. I mean, there's things that we can be doing here and now, and we've got plenty of evidence of the things that we can and should be doing, and we shouldn't get lost in these kind of theoretical conversations. One thing we do need to do is find a way, I think, of being able to walk and chew gum at the same time and have these conversations while we act on the evidence of things that we do need to be doing. In terms of embedding this within policy and governance, many people through the interviews kind of spoke about the importance of demand-driven funding as a driver of equity in the system. And again, I'll kind of draw attention to that kind of 2.7% kind of estimate. If demand-driven funding is really important, and demand-driven funding has led to a kind of massive expansion of participation across the system, how do we reconcile that with a kind of estimate that 1 or 2% of resourcing is linked to equity? It's something that we need to find a better way of being able to manage and think about equity in system-wide terms, not just in very small kind of pockets of the sector terms. A question we might kind of ask ourselves is whether TEXA will save the day. And I think of the 24 people that I had interviewed, pretty much all of them thought that the higher education standards framework that we have now, the 2015 threshold standards, is much better than the standards that we had previously. And it has a diversity and equity standard in it now, but the implementation of that really does come down to the choices of individual institutions. So in some ways it gets down to how do we coordinate the system overall, linking it in with policy and driving accountability to get better outcomes in this space. And as one policy analyst put it, I don't think a university with a weak equity profile is going to get any massive red flags. So I think TEXA is really, really important. The higher education standards is really important, but we shouldn't expect that to be the key driver of everything to do with equity and accountability in the system. The other question to ask ourselves in terms of embedding equity across the system is it just about universities? And we've got a little under 10% of the system that's related to non-university higher education institutions. And for them, their view is, well, we don't get CSP, we don't get access to HEP. The only thing we do get is access to fee help, and for that, the students get a 25% surcharge. Some data that I've got, which I've not sort of featured prominently in this presentation, is looking at total equity representation, trying to find a way of kind of bringing together low SES and regional and NESB and all the other groups. And within the new HEP space, on average, they're much better than many universities. So there is equity participation within the new HEP space, despite them not having access to all these sort of government subsidies. So how do we kind of bring that group into the frame as well as part of the system's view on things? In terms of transparency, I think there's a kind of rich story to tell there around being clear about what we're tracking, what we're measuring. But one thing that appears to be kind of missing overall from the system, in my view, is the currency of Australian higher education. And the currency of higher ed, from my view, is EFSL by fee type and by funding cluster. You won't see that kind of information out there, generally speaking, but I pulled that data from the department as part of the fellowship. And from that, I can calculate the base funding for these equity groups by within Commonwealth supported places. And we find that for regional students, the base funding is $2.3 billion. That's a lot of money. It's much higher than the $70 or $80 million in regional loading. And we can ask ourselves, are we getting good value as Australian society and as taxpayers and as individual regional students for that level of investment? And you could apply the same kind of question to every group. Are students with disabilities getting $636 million worth of value out of their education experience? And on we go. So that brings me back to the framework itself. And I said the three very simple kind of questions, but I think or three very kind of simple propositions, but I think the distinctive kind of part of that, which I think is really important, is thinking about it from a systems perspective. And the other part of the work that I've been doing is trying to grapple with the complexity of the system and different features of accountability and the various tiers of kind of higher education policy, and thinking about the ways in which these objectives kind of flow into these aspects of performance and accountability. So putting this up on screen today is more to whet your appetite rather than to bore you with another 20 minutes of explanation for this diagram. But I think just just maybe pick up on kind of James's point before around the importance of community, and we have things like client accountability and electoral accountability, and not just recognising it as a kind of what does government need to do to make universities accountable, or what do we need to do to make government more accountable to develop good policy. This is a sort of complex system. We need to find ways of optimising the interactions across all these tiers, all these elements, to drive progress against whatever the equity objective we might come up with as we transition to universal higher education. And that's it from me. Just in closing, I just want to say thanks to the National Centre, to Sue and everyone else. The support you've given has been fantastic. I wouldn't be here without you. To the Department of Education and Training for funding the program and for being so welcoming through this comment, and everyone else that's played a part of the research. So thank you.
Two burning questions. I see you.
When can you read the report? I'm hoping to have it out before Christmas. So drafts of...
Well, it's a comment that
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Any other comments? Okay, you can see that they have been 3 unique and quite different projects, but it's been wonderful how they've been able to work together. So we look forward to the second part of today's session. We're running a little bit early at this point, which is very, very well done to the 3 fellows, kept on their time. So please enjoy your morning tea, and we'll resume back in here at 11 o'clock. Thank you, everyone. Okay, welcome everyone. We'll just get started for the second session. So I wanted to introduce our facilitator. Robert Latter manages the Quality and Access branch in higher education in the Australian Government Department of Education and Training, and in his role he manages equity access programs, governance and system design. Robert has held various positions in the department, and in earlier life he was working in the IT area. So we very much welcome you, Robert, and thank you for your opportunity to facilitate shaping the future today. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. Welcome, folks. Welcome back. I'd like to start by paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and on the land where we all work and contribute each day, and pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as to those of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander heritage in the room with us today. So it's a pleasure for me to have this role, but I must say it's a shared pleasure, because the focus for today is around a conversation. And so feel free to contribute, to think about questions and comments and conversations, but it's kind of not a standard presentation where we'll have a point of view and you'll ask questions about it and then we'll move on. We'd actually like to get an engagement happening where people have a further point of view and a further point of view and something else that will then contribute to an overarching kind of conversation of the brains trust of the people in the room here today. So my role is the straightforward, easy role. And if I look around and there aren't any questions, if I can see someone with a burning expression on their face, I might well point to them and say, what is it that you'd like to contribute to that particular topic this morning? Don't hold it against me. Yes, I used to work in IT, but I was also, my first job was a commercial fisherman. And over my entire career, I've been aspiring to return to that, but not on a commercial basis. So today, our challenge is to kind of tease out thinking around 3 areas. We heard this morning areas of research, areas of policy, and earlier areas of practice. And while that was a great conversation starter, we'd like to think as widely as you wish around what research, what practice and what policy we ought to think about to take forward and to inform the work of the centre as well as to inform our collective work. And there's kind of this nice A intersection, B intersection C, with the bit in the middle being referred to as the sweet spot. I'd refer to it as the student-centred benefit, if you like. And I'd like us to keep thinking in terms of not just a research perspective or an in-practice perspective, but I'd like us to think about student-centred. And if we could keep that kind of in our minds, so this will be important because it will benefit students in this way, or the policy will inform how we improve outcomes for students. And that would be a kind of a nice kind of lens for that. So today we're going to kind of get some conversation started around research, then practice, then policy for about 5 minutes. So our panellists from this morning are going to have a crack at each of these individually. And then we're going to open it up to a discussion and conversation about, so what do we think about research and what research is important and what do we need to do next that hasn't been done before, or what do we need to do that might inform policy differently? And then we'll move into policy and have a conversation about, so where are the policy settings? And there were some interesting things this morning around accountability and evaluation and how they connect and areas for improvement. And then in terms of practice, what are the practice things that we need to take into account as practitioners? And how do you get through all of that stuff that's in the policy space and the research space and turn it into consistent approaches that make the most difference to the majority of students at the centre of our conversation? So, expectations and ground rules. I didn't create this slide, but it's not a bad slide. Each pillar will be introduced by one of the fellows. We covered that. Wait for a microphone. The reason we'd like you to wait for a microphone, even though I'm sure that in the far left corner here the voice is as booming as it can be and the far right bottom corner will be able to hear it, we actually want to record it so that the centre can work through the communique in a bit more detail and think about what was that comment, what was that question, and if we don't get them through the mics, we won't necessarily capture them in the best way. However, we'll see how we go. If you could just introduce yourself, that would be a terrific thing. Be frank. This is not the audience that I need to tell to be frank. Be continually frank is probably the better way to put it. Think big, you always do, and think about the intersection of those three things. Be succinct? No, not really. Take as much time as you like. We'll just kind of see how this goes and we'll cut it off if we need to. We've got about 20 minutes per topic and then a bit of a wrap-up. Okay? So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce the first of our panellists, James, to talk about research.
Okay, thanks very much, Robert. You'll see a list of research questions up there, so I'm not going to go through those. I'm going to talk more broadly to start off with. I guess where I wanted to start is when we've discussed this, Matt, Louise and myself, is that we've often said that in terms of when we came to the Equity Fellowship, that there's far more questions than answers as part of what we're doing, and that as we dig deeper, more and more questions are coming to light. And thinking about that and what that means in terms of being able to think strategically around research environment in this space is really important. I wanted to highlight that as part of the fellowship, one of the opportunities we've had is to work with NESHI, and that NESHI, the National Centre, does play a role as an incubator of ideas, has played a really pivotal role in terms of research grants, quite small research grants, but really important innovative research that's been happening in this space, and particularly that links research policy and practice domains as well, and hopefully we'll hear more about that as we move forward today. I want to talk about that broad national space. A few years ago, a lot of the research in this space was being funded in and through the OLT, and those opportunities have dried up now, and I think that's a really important thing that we need to recognise as a sector, is what does that mean for undertaking research in this space. It hasn't paralleled an increased investment in the ARC space, and in fact, feedback last year at the Australian Association of Research and Education conference from the ARC is that within the education space we're pretty harsh on each other when it comes to reviewing, so we often don't get past that first point. So it's a small number of projects within the education space and within the equity and education space that are getting funded in that space. notwithstanding, there's been important investments in the Indigenous space. We've seen the National Indigenous Research and Knowledges Network, and that's certainly been important to build capacity in the space. And that's a conversation I'd like to have today as well, is how do we build research capacity in the Indigenous higher education space? What opportunities are there? Who's been doing well in this space, and what has worked? The other thing that I think that we're really good at, which is consistent with a lot of equity work, whether that be in policy, practice or research context, is that we're good at doing things off the smell of an oily rag. We're used to not having a large proportion of funding to do the work that we do. So we actually see a lot of innovation happening in the space for actually not a lot of money, which I think is an important thing. We've seen an increased propensity, I think, in the last few years towards applied research context. And again, I think that's really important and comes back to what Robert was mentioning before around that student-centricness, but thinking around, well, what does this mean for policy and practice? How can we see improvements across the system as well? So I think that there's an important role there, and that's particularly important when we're looking at issues of cumulative impact, which I think Louise and Matt will probably pick up on as well. So when you belong to one or more of these equity groups, what does that mean? How do we get more sophisticated in understanding the synergies between that? Within the space that I've been working in, I think it's really important to mention that actually the equity and Indigenous space is quite a contested space. What fits where, why, from what philosophical basis does that work happen from, and why is that important? So I don't think that we can hide behind that. Certainly in my research, there's been a lot of Indigenous leaders and scholars that have spoken quite openly about the fact that there's a sense of being clumped into an equity space and that they feel uncomfortable with that, and that there are really important discussions to have around sovereign rights within this space, which can be different to an equity discourse. So we've got to mull through that, work through that, and what does that mean? I think that we need to have a conversation around the way we use research and evaluation data. How can we do that better? So that's great, we've got all this research out there. How is that getting used? What are people using it for? Is it influencing policy development? Is it influencing practice in a tangible way? Are we seeing quality improvement and strategy development being influenced by that within the higher education sector? How is this data being used by policymakers? How is it being used by politicians? So again, there was this discourse, if you like, through the interviews with my equity fellowship work, where a lot of the policymakers that I interviewed were saying how important quantitative data was. I had a lot of the Indigenous scholars saying how important the qualitative data was to marry up with the quantitative data, and I had a lot of the policymakers that were always also saying the reason quantitative is important is because that's what the executive of our department want, or that's what the ministers want. But actually, when you look at the narratives of the Indigenous scholars, many who have been in senior positions within government, they say actually when we were in those positions it wasn't necessarily the quantitative, it was the stories, it was that human experience that had an impact on the decisions that ministers made. So starting to understand that in greater detail in this space is really important, I think. And as I've mentioned, how is this being used by practitioners? And I know that Louise will pick up on that. I've mentioned the capacity building, but I think that we don't also just want to look at researching and investigating inequities. We need to think about how do we actively promote equity through our research processes and methods as well. So it's not just equity as the outcome, but it's how do we live and breathe that through the way that we engage in the research. And we know that there's a lot of participatory research methods that fit quite well in doing that. So that's really coming back to having a lens around principles and why are we doing what we're doing and so forth. And the last point that I wanted to make before I finish up and open it up to the participants is, I guess a take-home message for me is that thinking about research strategy development in this space is really important. What we've actually seen are a number of projects that are doing different things, looking at different equity groups, that gets a small piece of the limelight. And I don't know as a as a community that we're really good in thinking about that strategically. How do these projects align? Hopefully this morning you got a sense that we've tried through the equity fellowships to start to link and look at the connections between the research we're doing. So how can we do more of that? How can we collaborate better? How can we navigate the networks and the organisations and have buy-in with them and work with them to achieve better outcomes over the longer term? So from that, I'll hand it back to Robert and open it up to the audience to keep talking about what research questions should we be prioritising in student equity space.
Is there a burning question or comment to kick off the conversation?
Michelle Fleming, Pro Vice Chancellor Student Life at Flinders University. Thank you, James, for that. When I first read the agenda for today, I thought, that's odd that research is before policy. Because my initial thought was policy would go first in terms of we have the policy framework, which then drives the research and practice agenda. But then I thought a bit more about it, and I thought, what's interesting here is that it should be the research that we have done to date that is driving the policy agenda. So I then thought, yes, this is in the right order. And I guess for me, the questions are not so much around the research going forward, although that's incredibly important, but what has the research told us in terms of how we really push the policy agenda going forward? And given the very strange place we're in now, where, and please don't repeat me, the sector's likely to be potentially punished death by 1,000 cuts in terms of our funding because we haven't signed on to the reform agenda. What can we, the people around this room and the National Centre, do to really push forward the policy agenda based on what we know from the research to date?
That's a really interesting question. Do you want to add to that or answer it?
Thanks, Marcia. Yeah, John Phillimore from the National Centre. Just following up quickly on what Michelle's said, I think quite a few people here have probably received grants from the National Centre. So firstly, congratulations, and it's good to have you all here and you're still part of the community. I think I sent an email out about 2 months ago to people. One of my questions to those people was, can you give us any background or more further information on sort of what's happened as a result of those grants? I mean, we obviously try and keep tabs on it, and Bully Kardak sent us a note just the other day about a really good outcome from his research grant just recently on how we define and measure regional students, and it basically showed that there was a fault, if you like, in the way we the way government measured regional students, because basically, I think someone mentioned, was it you, Louise, how basically after the first year, if you then change your home address to where you're currently living, you undercount the regional students. So that was an important finding, if you like, and that's now being changed at government level. So we've asked people to come up with some more examples of, if they know of where their work has had academic impact. Of course that's important, but also any policy or practical impact both at university level and at government level. I mean, government, it's much harder. I mean, I said to Bully, you've had a direct sort of hit, a bullseye, and that's pretty rare. I mean, I've had about one bullseye, I think, in about 20 years of policy research. It doesn't happen that often. You can sort of say, research grant, research project, or report here, not even a dotted line, but a proper line going over here, outcome. That doesn't happen very often. That's probably too much to expect, but it would be nice to know whether things are going. So I guess the point of this is to say, if anybody who's done their grants knows what's going on, we clearly will keep on trying to push some of the findings, and we do that through our work. We try and also keep tabs on things, but if you yourself know of any impact, I think the area where we probably have least knowledge also would be at the university level. It's at that practice level. Government level, it's a bit, it's harder to actually have it happen, but it's potentially easier to find. At university level, it's not so easy because, of course, the practice is so spread around the country. So if anybody's got any more thoughts on how their research is having some impact, it'd be nice to know from our point of view as well.
Yeah. Perhaps I could add a question to that and maybe throw it to Sue, and that is, with the project to put all of the research that we have through the centre to make it more long-standing, to give it a life of its own, and also to make it accessible. What's the thinking around the taxonomy of research and how the research might map to the overall framework and might start to identify areas to go to find what's been done before in a better way, or areas to go where there are gaps in strategy?
Yes, so at the moment we've got 2 opportunities to really map the research. We'll be publishing all the national priority pool projects as well. There are 84 projects that have been undertaken over the last 3 years, and that's an opportunity to really look at a huge body of work. But we've also got, as John said, the grants program, which we have collated that information into 3 publications. And so it's now looking at that framework to try and bring that work together to look at the gaps. And we've done that through a number of focus publications. So we've looked at low SES, Indigenous, disabilities and regional. So we've got 4 focus publications where we've summarised where there are gaps at the moment and where we need to go. But we're really looking forward to focusing now that we've got another 84 possible projects that have been done over the last 3 years. So yes, there's a huge amount of research that's been done in this space. The challenge is bringing all that together and then looking at that framework as to where to next.
Yes. So we had a question here that I overlooked to start with.
Just while we're waiting on that next question, I just wanted to go back to the question before, and that's around, I think something that we can do quite tangibly is to work more closely at that research policy practice nexus. So rather than sitting in a little research bubble, have you got key relationships with policymakers that are sitting in there making the decisions, working on this stuff? If you are, share your research with them. They're your friends, they don't have to be your enemies. And I think this is something really important that we have to recognise. Point them to the areas of your report or papers that are good. Don't expect them to read through a 100-page document. They don't have the time to do that. But if you go page 47, line 3 and 4, really important recommendation for you to think about. It's those sort of things in the relationships. And that's not just with policymakers, it's with practitioners and it's with other key organisations within the sector. For my fellowship, working alongside and with and through NATSIHEC, with Universities Australia has been really important with the work that I'm doing and continues to be, and hopefully with TEXA moving forward as well. So I think thinking about that right from the start as a researcher is a really important thing in terms of that research dissemination process. And it makes it easier when you've got the National Centre developing portals which allow you to make your research more accessible as well.
My name is Penny Jane Burk, and I'm the Director of the Centre of Excellence for Equity in Higher Education at the University of Newcastle. I'm just thinking about the ways in which that question might kind of close down the kinds of ways we think about research questions, because inevitably research questions reflect different methodological perspectives, different experiential perspectives, different epistemological perspectives, and so on. So I'm just wondering if perhaps the question might be more about how might research questions be constructed and developed that are able to capture different perspectives and diverse perspectives, both from different communities like policymakers, but also students themselves, community organizations, and so on and so forth. So I think it relates back to what you just said, James, but just kind of a next step up. So rather than leaping into how we construct the questions, thinking about what is the process around that to ensure that we're not closing things down, narrowing the focus, and imposing a particular view of what equity is or should be or how we might be approaching it.
Just in front here.
Caroline Perkins, Executive Director, Regional Universities Network. I think in the research, one thing we've seen today is the complexity. If you really look in detail at the information that's available, that you get a very rich and detailed picture, and my fear is that in policy you just don't pick up that detail, so you've got a very generalised policy that really isn't responding to the needs of people or society. And I think the interesting thing about the Indigenous research was you were actually linking student outcomes a bit more to the outcomes for their communities. And if only that could be done a bit more, because that's a really positive impact for student success. So we hear so much about attrition and, you've got 50, 60% success rate. And, it's terrible because of the people who don't complete. But what about the impact of all those who do complete on their communities? And I mean, it's as true in regional Australia as it is for, Indigenous communities, that if that was captured a bit better and potentially captured in a way where the economic impact of that be shown, or the flow onto the communities, then it'd be very hard to argue against, or harder to argue against trying to give people a go at universities. So I think trying to get the equity research a bit more embedded in broader community outcomes is something which would be really of a lot of benefit to the regions, but also to particular communities like Indigenous communities. I think something else we're quite interested in is understanding the complexity of retention and attrition, because you've got just a single figure, and the real danger is that fundamental policy will be just based on those figures without any real understanding of the meaning of the outcome. And how do we understand the complexity better, and how its outcome reflects on Australian society and particular communities?
Oh, so two for the price of one, Caroline just said. So Karen Nelson, University of the Sunshine Coast. So I guess the area of research that troubles me, I suppose, is that we've spent a lot of time thinking about and looking at what the determinants of good outcomes are for students. And I think now we've got a much more broader understanding of the contextual elements that actually are highly influential on the ability of students and institutions to retain and graduate those students. And I'm worried that our focus in higher education research is a little bit soft in terms of just focusing on either students or institutions, and is ignoring that broader contextual situation. And Caroline mentioned communities, but it goes to the fundamental public policy platform around, if you like, regional or equity based elements that impact on people's abilities and their agency in terms of being able to engage in higher education. So to me, a big research question is, how do we actually influence policy outside our own higher education sector?
I think that you've highlighted a really important point, and I know that that each of us have spent some time with other departments on our secondments as well, and it highlights for me a real need to think about data linkage in this space. And how do we work not just with the Department of Education and Training, and the Indigenous space is a really good example. You've got policy and program responsibilities that are split between Department of Education and Training, Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. There's differences in opinion in the sector around whether that is or isn't working. But there are also other departments, Department of Social Services, in terms of the financial constraints that a lot of students from equity backgrounds face. But by and large, within the policy realm, there's not a lot of that data linkage going on at the moment. I know that there's steps towards improving that, and that there's some conversations around how can we do better on that. But that's a huge opportunity, I think, to do better in this space, and to start to think about some of those broader parameters, and not just the internal university student stuff, but the broader stuff. Do either of you want to pick up on that?
Yeah. You go first and I'll go.
I think in terms of kind of research questions we should be asking, I think we need to connect it to what is the purpose of higher education, and what is the kind of purpose of equity in higher education. And I think we do have cues around what that is within kind of higher ed policy, and one looks at the portfolio budget statements from the department. The objective is pretty clear. We fund higher education to deliver social wellbeing and economic productivity outcomes, amongst other things. It's a very kind of clear, concise sort of statement. And I think one thing we don't do is to measure in a positive way what is the contribution of higher education to those elements, and to specific communities along those lines. So I think we just need to be maybe focused a little bit more on those kind of positive, strength-based elements of the positive contribution of higher education, rather than what I perceive in kind of much equity research, which is, for whatever reason, we end up at quantifying the gap or the deficit that needs to be addressed in some way. So I think if we could find a little bit more better ways of being able to accentuate the positives and the kind of positive contributions, it might get us away from some of the challenges we have in terms of fending off death of 1,000 cuts year after year, because we can quantify, this investment is paying for itself, it is returning, social economic benefits, etc.
And to add on to that, for me, through this year, especially through the advisory group for my fellowship, we've spoken a lot about the intersection of different equity groups, and you talk about complexities. So, for example, looking at remote, you've got low SES, you've got indigeneity, you've got remote, obviously. How do they all interplay together? Do they compound? How do they all correlate? And I don't know if there's much out there. I'm opening it up, I guess. I'm keen for thoughts on how they compound, sorry, I'm trying to use my hand, how they all compound to actually, it's so complex. We often looked at one aspect. Mary?
Yeah. Thanks. I think that one way we could join up things better is to go to the broadest possible lens. And I agree about the positive non-deficit approach and so on, but if social inclusion is the object and education is a means to an end, what's missing is the Social Inclusion Board and place-based work and all of that thinking, which was about how we could make society in place more socially inclusive, of which education was simply one dimension. And so if we conceive of our work in those terms, then the big enemies are poverty and racism. Well, where's the national think tank around poverty? Why aren't we having, perhaps the department's inauguration, a kind of annual stock take of how poverty is changing in Australia and how regionality is intersecting with poverty, how class is changing, where the wealth is going, because that is the context in which we work. That's actually the problem we're trying to compensate for at the end of the food chain. So unless we've got, and I think one, that would lead to better understanding, but the other thing it does is bind people together, because it's something we're all trying to do something about, whether it's vet or schooling or ACOS or welfare or whatever it is. That is the common thing, and we should talk about the common thing more.
So thank you. I might come back now to Leanne.
Thank you. Leanne Holt, Director of Indigenous Strategy at Macquarie University and Deputy Chair of NATSIHEC. I just wanted to talk to the reservations about the status of Indigenous as an equity group, because I think it's important. It's an important conversation to have when we're talking about holistically all of this. And from my perspective, the challenges with Indigenous being an equity group is the concentration around widening participation, retention and success. And obviously we deem all of those to be extremely important. However, it misses the dialogue around Indigenous contributions to the knowledge base of universities. And so you've got Indigenous workforce up there, and I think that's a good example to talk to, in that when we have an Indigenous workforce strategy, is it an equity agenda, is it an equity plan, or is it about increasing the Indigenous knowledges within a university as a conduit of knowledge? And so I think that there needs to be more, I think when we talk about doing Indigenous research as equity research, that we need to be mindful of what is the purpose, what is the primary purpose, and how does that affect the other dialogue happening. So, I think commonly from an Indigenous workforce point of view, most of the university population would see that as an equity agenda. I don't. So I think that they're the things that we need to be considerate of in how we frame the policies and programs and research around Indigenous higher education.
Thank you. Does anyone on the panel want to respond to that or add to that?
I completely agree. And I think that links back to what Penny said earlier as well, as where do we start off with the conversation? What is the basis on why we're doing that? We've got to acknowledge that within universities, whether we like it or not, they are very Western mainstream institutions, and they don't fit either equity or Indigenous context very well. But the rationale for thinking about some of those differences can be quite different from an equity frame versus an Indigenous worldview or an Indigenous frame. And I think we need to start to be paying attention to that. I would say, though, that it is acknowledged that there are really important investments that have been happening within the equity space that have really supported moving the Indigenous higher education agenda forward. And a good example is HEP. If we look at the recent evaluation report, a significant portion of funding through HEP was directed to low socioeconomic students that were Indigenous, and it's really supported outreach work in that space, which is important. But we need to go further, and we need to start thinking about that in a much more nuanced way, and I think it's through partnerships with organisations like NATSIHEC that can happen.
We might just pause there in the interest of time. We've moved from research and we are talking about policy engagement, so if you've got a burning question on that, we might just hold it for a moment and bring Matt on board to talk a bit about the policy, if you like, one-pager, to trigger some further thought processes. So I've now got the policy slide up.
I'm going to keep my comments brief because I think it's important to keep the kind of conversation moving and sort of hearing more from you than from me. But I think one thing that I want to accentuate in terms of the kind of question that's up on screen is the distinction between higher and tertiary. And what we've seen over the last few years is some big challenges in the vet sector, which is a big part of tertiary ed. Higher education has sort of grown considerably. And I think, whilst there's kind of immediate challenges around affordability of higher education here and now, that's kind of occupied government over the last few years of trying to grapple with the implications of demand-driven funding. I think in the years ahead, there's plenty of signs that we need to be thinking more carefully around the kind of interactions between vocational education and higher education, the extent to which the kind of binary divide between the two needs to be streamlined or not. There's some big policy questions there, I think, in terms of post-secondary tertiary education and the way in which we design a system that can fulfil the needs of Australian society, both in terms of social wellbeing and economic productivity. So that's one thing I just want to encourage people to sort of think about, is that tertiary rather than sort of higher education kind of notion. As participation is likely to grow over coming years, there's a continuing question around, how do we as a society fund that? We've seen kind of big challenges around that over the last few years. These challenges they're not going to go away. We need to find a way of being able to get there. And if we can't find a way of being able to resolve these kind of issues from a policy perspective, what happens next? Is it what are the equity implications around the policy changes that can be made if we can't find a more significant, substantial kind of policy reform that deals with society's increasing needs for tertiary, vocational and higher education. One thing that's, I think, just to draw a connection between the kind of research side of things and policy is really around the availability of data around the performance of higher education and tertiary education that can really inform our policy design and inform our research collection. There are, the 2016 data release is great. I'm sure everyone in the room has been sort of ploughing into the implications of that data, but it's still, it's kind of a bunch of static Excel spreadsheets rather than allowing us to really delve into a really nuanced view about what's going on in the system. And I think if we can't find a way of being able to explore what's going on in higher education in a more nuanced way, it's going to limit the capacity of researchers to do good research, and it's going to limit the the efforts of policymakers to make good policy informed by evidence and make it harder for practitioners to do the kinds of things that need to be done on the ground floor as well. So I might kind of leave it there, but a kind of additional kind of attribute for that, which I'll close off on, is I suppose the kind of issues of scale with the data. We tend to focus on the kind of big groups. It's kind of regional, it's the lowest yes. And myself, I mean, I come from a deaf family. Sign language is my first language. We find in the higher education data collection there are about 100 students with Auslan in the system. That's never going to kind of warrant status as an equity group in any way. But yeah, the data's there. Why don't we report on it? Why don't we include in the higher education data collection, this is the experience of people whose first language is Auslan, you know? And using that as an analogy, you could apply that to any number of groups that are out there, remote, particular refugee groups, whatever it may be. But we need a way of being able to kind of harness and utilise the data at a system level and an institutional level to be able to let people do the good work that they're capable of.
Yeah, thank you. I might just take host prerogative or facilitate prerogative a little and just touch on a couple of policy things that kind of connect with that. There is significant interest in the tertiary story as opposed to the higher education story or the vet story, and work that people in my group are progressing through now are, you know, what's the tertiary strategy and what's the tertiary kind of goal and vision, and what might inform that, and what's the role of vet versus higher ed and how they connect into play. I'm not saying we have the answers yet, but it's an interesting piece of thinking and consultation. The other pieces that fit within that are the review of the Australian Qualifications Framework, which goes to the question of qualifications at levels, which spans both the vet and the higher education sector from Cert 1 all the way through to PhD, and the crossover and duplication, particularly at the middle levels between vet and higher ed, and when is a diploma or a higher ed degree versus when is it a vet degree. And then the obvious question that is the portability of qualifications between sectors and students from equity groups in particular who want to move between, and how do we support that while keeping in mind the kind of the framework and how it fits. And some of the unintended consequences of the framework go to the fact that many Australian labour awards now tie to an AQF level. And so if you start to tinker with the AQF, you also start to bring on the role of employer groups and unions and so on around, you know, what will happen with wages and so on. So it does take you to a broader conversation about the role of education in the productivity and social inclusion of Australia, and, you know, what the overarching driver is. On the back of that, there's a review of the provider category standards, which looks at, in the TEXA standards, the question of what do you need to be a university, or what do you need to be a higher education provider, and other standards and classifications right. So there's kind of all those things at play. But work that we've done around, earlier work around transparency in higher education, which go to admissions transparency, and the work that Kerry Lee, she's here, she had to duck out for a teleconference, but Kerry Lee Krause is kind of chairing on behalf of the sector to look at how do we provide more simple, more straightforward, more transparent information about admission. And then a second piece of work the standards panel did on looking at completion and attrition, which is always a tricky one. The question that the higher education standards panel had was, is there cause for concern? And, you know, right now you see the media at the moment covering the question about, you know, the new data's out and it looks like it's a bit up, and if you look at the data for Western Australia, it looks like it's bad for some and not bad for others. And of course that's always a useful conversation to have, but it's underpinned by some rationale and logic in terms of the demography of students that those universities are supporting. But the other question that goes to this is, how good is that data? And the better we get at it, the more we want it to be better. And work in that place was to look at how do you connect the VET universal student number with the CHESN number, and the ability to maybe follow students in and out of the sector, which is the tertiary sector. And maybe, as we were talking, I think last night over a glass of wine, how do we connect that with what are people leaving to go to jobs rather than just exiting the system, and are they re-entering at some point in the future? And some of the research that tells us we needed to lengthen the study, not to just do 9 years and say, did you complete in 9 years, therefore you didn't complete. But in fact, some people take longer than that because they go in and out of work, they change their study patterns and so on. So with better data comes better opportunity, but also comes greater challenge for government and universities to kind of collaborate on what are the big questions here and how do we start to solve them in ways that make a better difference. But I might open it up, I'm happy to answer anything on those, but I might open it up to further comment around Matt's. Louise, do you want to come on the back of that?
For me, it's more of a reflection on what you're talking about, that national data, but it also goes back, I think, to Caroline, what you were saying about having policy that works across Australia but is relevant to a range of contexts. I can't remember if it was Caroline or Karen, sorry. When we went to Canada was a fascinating example because it's across Canada, it's not done at a national level like we've got here. Instead, it's done at a provincial level, which means there's a lot of variety across the state, across the nation. But around its data, they don't have a lot of the data that you're talking about that we use and that we use to inform our practice and that we use to inform our policy. It doesn't exist. It's done, so for example, in British Columbia, they're quite good at going from kindergarten through to university. But then in other states, provinces, they don't even have that. So it's just more of an observation that when I was there, I didn't even realise it's something I take for granted. And it's data that I was sharing when we went to the conference. Oh, we've got this and we've got this. And people are like, oh my gosh, we would love to have that. And I was like, oh, okay. And so it's more of a reflection that there's lots of positives, I think, about us having that national system. But then once again, speaking as a West Australian, which has quite a small power base sometimes, it's also got to be relevant to the context. So it's getting that balance. And so that's more my comment going on. There you go.
Yeah. Other comments? Bully?
Thank you. Bully Kardak from the Trobe University. I'm Associate Professor in Economics and Finance. I just sort of draw the research to the policy because I just wanted to say something about there's lots of projects that have been funded by the National Centre, the HEP projects, and sometimes they focus in on very particular groups and very particular issues. I think one of the things that we need to get better at is to draw those out and bring them to a bigger sort of overarching theme. This is a point that Mary Kelly was bringing up, and it's like trying to sort of say, okay, I'm working on this specific issue, but what conclusions or what implications can I draw from what I've done to have an impact on you, Rob, right? You're thinking about the sector, not about one particular group. So how can I feed that into you? And I think we need to, sure, we're all interested in our particular sort of specialty areas, but I think we need to remember, we need to feed into this debate at the highest level because the case in point is what you initially said, that you're doing work or your department's doing work on the role of higher ed and the role of vet, and I can just imagine that's been commissioned because people are saying, well, the loan book's blown out because of the uncapping of demand or the uncapping of supply, I should say, and so what are we doing here? Right? So we need to be taking the work, the equity stuff that we're doing, feeding that into that debate and saying, well, what we're doing here is we're doing this, we're helping people who are not going to get opportunities and have an impact on that debate about what are we doing here, because at the end of the day, there's going to be a treasurer or a minister for education who's going to come along and say, this is out of control, we've got to cut this back, and it's going to be taken out of our hands. So we need to feed into that debate with our knowledge at the highest possible level so we can influence that and get the most efficient, effective outcomes for the students that are trying to learn and trying to get, out of poverty, as Mary Kelly said. I think that's ultimately the objective. So, while what we do is really interesting and we really enjoy it and we're really passionate about what we do, we need to work harder to try and feed that up and have as much policy impact as we can. I think that's a really important point that brings the research to the policy. Thanks.
Thanks. Over here.
Thanks. Anne Stewart, Adjunct Fellow and retired equity practitioner.
This is a subject that has come up on a number of occasions previously, and I just want to make a very quick point, as I think that it goes to the questions we are asking about influencing policy and what kind of policy decisions might be made, and as Mary has said about the larger questions and answers that we're supposed to be influencing in society in general, and the smaller numbers about what impact are we having on the students that we're working with in terms of their life opportunities. And the capacity of CHESM to inform us, I think, is good, but it's limited. And it's a point that I've made previously, which is I think we need to look at what they've done in Britain and now for a number of years, and we need to look at having some capacity to do that here, which is to track people from the moment they engage with their education at preschool level through to when they go out to employment and potentially return into education at postgraduate level. And until we do that, we are always going to be missing a capacity to tell a story. There's two aspects of the way in which the policy makers are influenced. One is the numbers game. We know this inside out. We're also hearing the narrative where you can come up with a good story and that will influence people. But you need both. And we've got the capacity, if we are able to track people, to look at the large picture and to drill down to that almost minuscule level of individual narrative about what the impact has been on individual lives. So I think it's a really important question that we've never been able to get resolved, and until we do, we're always going to be missing the capacity to do the kind of research and to tell the kind of stories that we need to be able to tell.
Other perspectives here? Nadine?
Thanks, Marcia. Nadine Zacharias from the National Centre. I'm going to go into that exact same vein that Anne and Bully have started us on, and I'm going back to Matt's idea of the era of universal participation. And I think while the numbers are increasingly telling us a story, as a sector and as individuals, we don't have our head around it. We attitudinally, in terms of structures, processes, strategies at the institutional level, we just do not have an understanding and a grasp of what that means for each and every one of us doing our jobs on a daily basis. So I'd like to make a passionate argument for a better understanding of our student cohorts at that level that Anne is talking about. I'm doing a fascinating research project this year at Deakin where we look at failure and persistence, and we're interviewing students, and the last one I interviewed, education student who had failed as much as she passed, and to listen to these stories and what keeps students going in the modern higher education system is truly amazing and fascinating, and I think that's the way to go, and Louise's project is a fabulous starting point. And then to go for some really bold new ideas. I agree with you, we need the policy reform, but we need some really new ideas, and we're looking to Canada, we're looking to the UK. My context is the German context, where the equivalent of the AQF is not hierarchical, where you don't go to one system for up to a certain level of qualification and then you go into a different system entirely, where you can obtain the equivalence of a master's degree in the vocational sector, where you can be a master, builder, carpenter, electrician, you name it, and you're not allowed to train others, you're not allowed to have your own business until you're at that level of mastery, and it's equivalent. So there's very different, and then there's very different models that emerge out of that. So my cousin, for example, did his bachelor while being embedded in his organisation where he had done his 3-year apprenticeship as an industrial designer. Why can't we do that sort of stuff? So I think there's the ideas are out there, but we have to look and listen and then bring that back here and apply them to our context.
Thank you. Others want to build on that or?
Hi, I'm Renee Hindmarsh from the ATN, and I guess my comment, I was really interested in the observations about the importance of bringing those individual stories and case studies, because it is that emotion that government responds to. But I think, as James mentioned, they do also respond to data and to the raw numbers. And I was thinking about the flip side of it, and sometimes HEP can be a really vulnerable pot of money. It's not enshrined in legislation, and it is something that's quite easy to pick off. And I wondered if there had been any research into the cost of not supporting those equity students adequately, because there is a financial cost and also a social cohesion cost if we don't address some of these broader questions and make sure that our cohort is as inclusive as it can be.
Does anyone want to cap on that? I'm not going to dive in from a government perspective. That would be brave of me. But the question about, so do universities understand the value, the universities more broadly understand the value of the work that you all do here and understand the opportunity cost if there is an opportunity cost at some stage in the future? Andrew?
Thanks, Robert. Well, just to pick up on that, I think there's an opportunity here in that the Christian Porter paper a few months ago that outlined, why is that so bad? That outlined the costs of 3 groups, and I'm not going to remember them now, but so I think carers was one, people on disability pension was a second, and there's a third group, and it did a classic kind of accounting trick of multiplying the cost to the economy of these people who were disproportionately going to be on long-term transfer payments. And so the government actually does this work for us. They create all sorts of horrendous figures about people who are in the lowest decile often, or who are the most disadvantaged. So to the extent that we can show that higher education is a form of social mobility for those exact people, we can kind of draw the links between, thank you, we can draw the links between our work and the economic cost. We don't perhaps do that enough. We do sometimes involve multipliers, particularly with regional cases, where we say our regional campus is worth $100 billion because of, we multiply it out. But there is an opportunity, particularly in what the government has recently done itself, around the cost to taxpayers of these people on long-term transfer payments. And where we have, say, enabling programs, in which about 30% of students are from the lowest decile, a lot of those people are in those exact groups. So there is probably some more maths to be done to show the way that getting to particularly disadvantaged groups has an economic benefit that is enormous, according to the government's own figures.
Other perspectives on that dimension? John? Thanks. Both mics.
Competing microphones. Basically you're talking about a justice reinvestment for framework of thinking about the opportunity costs savings to government. So that can be done. It's obviously very powerful, but you need to have the access to the data. And we were talking before about the tax office issue is another area where you can get a lot of powerful information, but there's been massive amounts of problems over the years of trying to get access to the tax office data, and it's like we seem to be making incremental steps along the way, but how open that's going to be to researchers is another matter. It sort of links up with the research side of things as well, but from a policy perspective, that seems to me to be the most powerful tool, and at the moment it's sort of locked, I think, within government rather than being, and we all know the privacy reasons and other things like that, but that seems to be the most powerful entree into that question of being able to show the potential savings to government from an upfront investment which can produce long-term savings. And it's always the desiderata of research to show that, and that's the whole thing, all that stuff to do with early childhood all the way through. That's really the key to get into that system, but how we do that is we're knocking at the door, but it hasn't quite happened yet. And then it links also then into, if you want to go the further back you go, I mean, we're talking about saving on transfer payments for adults, I assume, but if you work your way back to all the way, someone said, go back to preschool and trying to get identification and track people, as we know, and we had this at Penny Jane had her forum a couple of years ago in Newcastle, this issue of states. I mean, here we are, I don't know, is there anybody here from a state government? No. This is not surprising, because higher education is seen very much as a Commonwealth responsibility. But we all know, year 12 back, schools are run by states, and yet we don't seem to see the two of them as being somehow linked. So Queensland, I think, actually does quite a lot of work, and it seems to me that the Queensland Department actually is quite interested in what happens in terms of equity at higher education. But for a lot of reasons, states say, well, what's it got to do with us? We don't run universities. Clearly they're involved in TAFEs, but they're not all that interested in universities. And higher education and the Commonwealth's not all that interested, really, in what's happening in the schools. So, surprise, surprise, they're interested, but they're not got the levers in many respects. So we've got to somehow, if you want to try and crack that nut, That is the issue. I don't think you're never going to have everything from preschool all the way through to employment unless somehow someone's got to have the incentive to say, okay, we've got to get together, state and Commonwealth, to try and find a way to track people through, because it just won't happen. That's why it happens in England. It doesn't happen in the UK. It happens in England because it's the same system, and it happens in Canada in a particular province like British Columbia, but not Alberta. But it doesn't happen in Australia because of that Commonwealth state divide, and they have different incentive structures and different responsibilities. So unless that's cracked, you're never going to get that really longitudinal stuff, which would give you even better evidence of how you're going to save money across the life cycle.
Mike.
Hi, Mike Teese from UA. I'm interested in Matt and Nadine's comments about higher education equity. Is that better? In an era of expanding post-maths...
We might just switch mics for you, Mike.
Is that better? Oh, good. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm interested in Matt and Nadine's comments in particular, and Andrew Harvey's as well, about higher education equity, tertiary education equity in an era of expanding post-maths or approaching universal participation. I wonder if you see, it's a question for the panellists as well as everyone here really, do you see an opportunity for us in the review of higher education equity groups, and how would we go about getting the most advantage for the higher education equity scene from this review? Be interested in your advice.
So who'd like to go with that first? Matt?
I might take a first stab, but also I think we've got Wojciech in the room who has been leading that project, and he's probably best to comment on that from the person that's been doing that work himself. But
the mic's coming.
The mic's coming. But just as a sort of precursor to that, I think there is a tendency to try and roll up to a bigger kind of group, low SES or regional. You kind of see that with remote, that it's seen as too difficult to sort of deal with the small numbers of remote students, so we kind of roll it into regional. I think there's kind of problems with that. If we roll it up too much, we miss out on the nuance. And I think there's potentially ways in which we can not set the thresholds too high for the groups that we measure and report against, so that we just have kind of visibility about what's going on. So whether it's someone who's a Scientologist or someone who's comes from a particular kind of Asian country, we just have transparency around that. As to whether or not we prioritise those groups within policy, that becomes a question for governments and for policymakers. But we don't lose sight of the need for at least some transparency about what's going on for some of the smaller groups in the system.
Right.
And maybe over to you, Wojciech.
Thanks, Matt, for this. Look, I'd rather not really comment on the project itself, but I certainly look. I mean, I think just a broad comment on obviously the sort of tension between the kind of the need for a detailed, really kind of detailed information about particular groups down to the individuals, and the kind of complexity that that follows. And I mean, it is obviously a contested space, and people. Some people essentially postulate that fewer broad groups are going to be kind of preferable, and for various reasons, while other people would postulate going down to the kind of very sort of detailed and individualized path. I think that the kind of the need for transparency is there. Whatever kind of model it is out there, there needs to be. We need to make sure that it is kind of transparent. Everybody knows how it is defined and what the advantages and disadvantages of using a particular framework are.
Will that also consider the question of whether Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander would be considered its own definition as opposed to part of low SES or not part of low SES? Because there's an interesting policy question there where if you look at it one way, you could say more than a third of Indigenous students are low SES and therefore well supported. But if you look at it the other way, it's about 3% of low SES students are Indigenous. And so there's a chance that we miss the impact opportunity that situation and context and regional remote in particular need to support that. That we had more policy settings and more levers for funding than we currently have. James, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to extend on that a little bit, and it goes back to a couple of the earlier questions as well, particularly the issue that was raised around HEP, because I think that actually some of the reports, evaluation reports and reporting around HEP actually has some really rich stories in there, and by and large there hasn't been any sort of meta-analysis done on those stories, and it certainly didn't come out in the evaluation report by Ace Lallen in the way that I thought that perhaps that would, and I think that that's a huge opportunity for us to actually to think about that. And I think, from a policy perspective, really pushing the agenda around making a lot of the reporting more public can make a big difference in being able to do some of those meta-analyses, etc. And going back, there was a bit of a discussion around policy gaps before as well, and the need to link different data sets and so forth. And one that we've been really interested with in the Northern Territory context has been literacy within the Indigenous higher education space. We know that literacy is a really significant barrier. We know that that relates to schooling, etc. But we also know that it's a massive policy gap. This is an area where the policy responsibility is being handballed between one department to another, whether that be at the state or Commonwealth level or between different departments at either of those levels. And it's falling through the cracks. And unless we actually have somebody within government that says, actually, we need a coordinated response to this, it's a no-brainer in terms of investment. If we see investment in that space, we will see better outcomes in terms of Indigenous higher education. I'd have no doubt about that, but it is actually looking at the complexity within the policy space and how we deal with that that's really important.
Right. So that's a really good segue into the next session that Louise will trigger our thinking on, which goes to the practice and how the practice makes a difference, informed by the research and the policy.
Thanks, Robert. So there's so many thoughts going through my mind right now about where do we take it. So I apologise, you're about to hear them all. So what questions should we be asking and what actions should we be making in regards to how all this comes in together in a practical way for the benefit of the most marginalised students in Australia? So I'm not really going to, they're food for thought questions. For me, I'm reflecting back on my year and about where I think it will go, and a time that's really uncertain. We've got reform packages going up. Will they, won't they? Maybe not, but we'll wait and see. We've got internal restructures happening at universities, past or present or about to happen again. So there's external pressures, there's internal pressures, and how do they affect our practitioners and in what we're doing on an everyday basis? But at the same stage then, we need to continue working for the benefit of the students that we engage. And evaluation forms a critical part of that, and it's an essential skill that's embedded into our programs, and practitioners have an important role to play in this. I think there's that researcher versus practitioner, but it's also, there's so much overlap. Practitioners do so much action research every day, but it's informed by what's happening in the research space, and it's informed by what's happening in policy. And the National Centre brings it together and communicates it out there. So that's some thoughts. You've also got in front of you the report, the latest publication. That's the latest publication, yep. And it was great to read through and to see a lot of the work that's been done. But one thing I noticed was a lot of it is in the outreach space. It's in the pre-access, it's in the access. And I think for me, when you look at equity, they're moving it onto in the participation and then the attainment. We're not necessarily celebrating or communicating, I think, to the degree that we could, what our successes are and sharing what are our lessons and how can we improve our practice in that regard. Just some observations. And then at the same stage, from a policy point of view, we've then got the recent report that came out around, the discussion paper that came out around completions and attrition. And then finally, another thought just to throw out there is coming back to the tertiary space and how, so I'll give you an example in remote. Females massively overrepresented when it comes to engaging enrolled in higher education from remote communities. I don't know, very open if other people do know, what males then involved in the vet sector? Are they overrepresented? Are they underrepresented? How do these all fit in together? What's our role in this? How do we then take that forward? Do we need to be working more with the TAFEs in remote areas? We do a little bit in Western Australia in the outreach space, but then also participation, then reporting. Yeah, these are some of my thoughts. Welcome to my world. Anyone else? I guess, yeah, I'm opening it up. I'd love to hear thoughts about, as practitioners, where do we take it into the future? What is our focus?
So I suppose the question is practice informed by research and policy, or is it a different world? Is it driven by the immediate need as opposed to the considered strategy? What do people think about that? Bully, do you want to kick off on that, or your own dimension?
Yeah, it often feels like practice is based on experience, and I feel like people are really passionate about it and enthusiastic, and they go off and they do things, and they don't consult always on best ways to have some evaluation ex post, so you can prove what you've done has some effect. So that, I think if we did that more, that would be really good. You know, I know there are lots of practitioners, or there's some practitioners here that actually do that, but I think in general, you know, you see like HEP money come into universities and small dollops going all over the place, and you know, you think, hang on, isn't that being done by this program? And you've got like 5 different programs doing very similar things, possibly overlapping. And so, you know, sort of everyone's well-intentioned and it all has a good effect, but it might be more effective if it was sort of coordinated a bit better. So I don't know. Yeah, these are my thoughts.
Other thoughts on that line? Gabby, down to the bottom left.
I think there is a perceived or actual division between research and practice. The practitioners will say that we're on the coalface and we see what happens, we know the students, we see the results, but we're so flat out doing, we often don't have time to evaluate properly and research properly. And the researchers probably say the opposite, in that they've done the research and they know, you know, what the issues are, and never the twain shall meet. Now, that's not always the case, but that does happen. I think the nature of the public policy situation when HEP came in was that we were all in a mad rush to establish ourselves, do something in a period of time that was quite short. So in its initial stages, we didn't know how long it would last, so we only had a year to prove ourselves, all those sorts of things. And some of those policy situations are still in place today. Certainly after 7 years, and this is a great publication from the National Centre, all the work that's in there is really long established, evaluated really well. And the difficulty we will always have is within our own institutions knowing what the left hand is doing. At a national level, it's trying to bring all that information together, and the National Centre does a great job in that. And those sorts of things will always be an issue, because there's what happens in research world and what happens in practice world, but all we can do is really try to sort of get everybody talking to each other. And things like today is a really important part of that, and the conference. So, thanks.
Thank you. Others on that theme? We might start up on the far right to give the mic runners the exercise that they were looking for today. Or the one mic runner, because the other one's not working.
Hi everyone, my name's Cheryl Godwell. I'm the Manager of Indigenous Student Services at Darwin University in Darwin. Thank you all for your presentations and the work that you're doing in the fields that you're working. Louise, I really love your question and the fundamental challenge between policy and practice. As a practitioner, it's one of my biggest frustrations, and I think one of the greatest dangers that we have is in the lag that happens in our ability to actually respond to students' needs. really proactively. So a lot of their issues are very current and very real, and are very often the barrier and the impediments to them actually achieving or retaining, being retained in universities. But then we're compounded by so much policy and so much rhetoric around what's intended or intended to have an impact on those students that very often it misses the mark. And then the opportunities for us to actually develop or design or implement really innovative practices or approaches with students are very limited, and we're quite often hounded by a lot of the policy and the very rhetoric that's there and that's intended to actually avail us the opportunity to do these things. So, and I can equally answer the question around where are the men from our perspective, and we're quite unique in that we're a dual sector institution. Our majority of our Indigenous students are female in the higher ed sector, around the 75% mark, and mature age females. And interestingly, the demographic is inverted in the vet sector, that it is actually 75% men. So we actually have the joy, honour and privilege of working across both of those sectors and across both the state and territory and Commonwealth governments, and trying to navigate all of those spaces constantly. So
the joy, honour, privilege and challenge of doing those things. Mary?
Just want to comment on where practice sits in the great triangle of things, and I thought the question itself underestimated the power of practice and the reality of our current lived lives. And I do not live in the world where it's all just made up and in bits. That's not what happens. And personally, I think, pardon me, practice has as much influence on research as the other way around, and that's also a good question. How much research is using practitioner knowledge in order to even set its questions before it heads off? So we don't want to set up this thing about who's listening to whom. We've got a triangle, which is policy, practice, research. We know nothing works unless we sort that all out together. So let's concentrate on that. And so we live in a world where the policy settings to some extent drive what your practice will be. And I don't just mean funding, I also mean the guidelines and the allowability of certain things and the timeframes around certain things. That's much more powerful a question for me on a daily basis than what research sits behind this. That's just a natural question you ask yourselves. What do we already know about this thing before we try something else? We should all do that and admit to that space all forms of knowledges, Indigenous knowledge, practitioner knowledge, everything. Stuff from outside about poverty, stuff from outside about productivity, whatever. So that is the question we should all say. Before we do X, what do we know about X, and how can we progress X better in the next step? So I've lost my way now, but basically I think we just catastrophised something that isn't a catastrophe, that is developing in its sophistication around that, and that's precisely why we invented the National Centre, to bring all this together. So why would we go back and start talking about a sort of pre-National Centre universe that doesn't exist anymore? I think we should stick to the program.
Good point. I'm going to allow a couple more questions and then we might work to a conclusion. So over here, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Judy Skeen, sort of semi-retired equity practitioner alongside Anne. I just wanted to kind of reinforce what Mary said, because I also see it as a false dichotomy between research and practice. I think there are many of us in this room who have been long-term practitioners who have research training. I think the equity practitioner community is extremely passionate but also well informed. I guess the extra comment that I'd really like to reinforce, and it goes back to also what Gabby was saying, is about the sustainability of the skills within the sector, because the uncertain policy environment that we live in does have an influence on institutional support for equity practice. and I see that threatened sometimes where you have short-term funding, you bring excellent staff and you know, colleagues are trained up, and then the funding ceases and you see programs disappear. And I think as a community we have to really think about this and about how we do sustain that skill level going through into the future, and how we keep those linkages and communication going. Just another little observation too, having been around for a while, it was always really helpful to me over the years when the department hosted policy forums, national policy forums, and brought everybody together. Especially when I was first in the sector, that was really, really helpful, both not just from the networking and hearing what people were doing, but bringing those different people into the room, the policy, the research, the different sectors, and I really feel like, you know, we can't do enough of that, but I know it doesn't happen very often at the moment, so maybe that's a practical thing that we could be doing to keep these important conversations going. Thanks.
Thank you. And the last question goes to Nadine as Equity Fellow Gold Card.
Thank you. Yeah, nowhere near retirement. That's
Gold
right.
star.
And I'm going back to my to last year's equity fellowship, which found exactly that. You know, that HEP was used very much by institutions within their context and their priorities and their demographic profiles to develop bespoke programs, you know, that worked in their context. And there was an amazing variety, you know, and there were these programs that Bully talked about, you know, where things seemed to happen a bit more ad hoc. And then there were institutions, including two of my case studies, where it was absolutely planned and where there were people there who were absolute professionals. And going back to James's finding around, you know, like it is those long-term practitioners who shape the quality of these programs, and Penny Jane has written about it in her book as well, you know, and I think that is under-theorised, the impact of individual practitioners in setting up really holistic strategic programs that make amazing differences within the institution. So that's one point. The other point is that we haven't told the student story sufficiently with HEP, but we also haven't told the institutional stories sufficiently. And when you go back to the 2010 reports, you know, those of you who remember, where we were asked, how have you set up your programs and how do they link up with existing practice? That there's some amazing stories in there that illustrate that diversity, you know, where there were people absolutely evidence-informed, both from the research and from their own demographic, you know, from the HEMS data, and set up very tailored programs. And this is what we haven't, you know, the story we haven't told. And with the evaluation framework emerging, you know, I think we have another opportunity to make that happen, because that will drive both practice and research in institutions and across the sector.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. So in the script there was Robert summarises everything that everyone said in about 10 minutes. Fortunately, we can ad-lib the script. I think there have been some really powerful messages, and no surprises, but surprising in the sense of the high-level perspectives and kind of the aha moments around, really, we need to think about how we influence policy in different ways. We need to keep the student in the centre. The data is just a wonderful thing, and if we just keep using that better, would be good, as long as the government let us do it. That would be good. I heard death by 1,000 cuts a couple of times, but I'm not responding to that at all, nor citizenship stories or jokes. So I'm wondering if I could now throw back to Sue to kind of talk about the next steps and where this will lead and how it might then inform some further policy or further communication with the sector.
Thank you, Robert. It's a nice segue. All right, so where we're going from here is that everything's been recorded, and what we'll be doing is developing this fabulous communique. So thank you very much. This forum's allowed us to be able to bring everybody's collective ideas together, and hopefully we'll be able to move forward from there. And there's been some brilliant ideas here. I can see that Robert's going to be looking at a policy forum, I'm sure, bringing people together again next year.
We'd love to.
There's got to be some ways that we can continue these conversations. So I wanted to thank everybody, because this is a real opportunity for us to bring together that evidence base and to really talk about where we need to go with policy and have that national impact. And it is amazing just hearing everyone, because you are such a wonderful group where you're able to talk about how we've got this wonderful sense of cooperation and coordinated approach in Australia, which I think that we should be very, very proud about. And we're moving forward on building that national narrative. I wanted to, after the thought-provoking discussion, to sincerely thank our fellows, because their work has been just a wonderful piece of work this year, where the three of them have been able to work together and really follow through on how they can emphasise the fact that equity does really matter, and it is a central requisite for us to have an equitable economy and society. And I wanted to also very much thank you, Robert, because what you've allowed us to do through the Equity Fellows program, and also through your participation today, is to really bring the work of the 6 fellows together. Today's forum would not be possible without acknowledging the work of a dedicated group of people, and I really want to acknowledge the Australian Government Department of Education and Training for the funding, and also for Curtin University. And as I've just said, it's been wonderful to have 3 fellows share their information, but also Robert to be able to bring all this information together this morning. I wanted to also thank the Equity Fellows program group. There's been a program selection and reference committee, because they've managed to choose 6 outstanding equity fellows over the 2 years, and we've been able to build a significant piece of work there. So there's a few of those people here today. I wanted to acknowledge them. Mary especially, Richard James, Vicky Ratcliffe, and also the chair of that group has been Leslie Parker, who was unable to be here today. We're also supported through the National Centre through a very strong board, and some of those members have managed to make it to the session. Some are apologies here today. And we also have an advisory board. It's with the volunteer work from this group, because it's not a paid position on both board and also the advisory committee, but it is an opportunity for them to really be able to support the direction that the National Centre needs to go. And I thank them all for their work. I'd also like to thank the EFIA committee, particularly Gabby O'Brien as president of the EFIA group, because it has been a wonderful privilege to work together with your team and to be able to be on the first day of your conference. And we look forward to presenting quite a bit more of the work over the coming days of the conference. So thank you very much for your support here. I'd also like to thank the National Centre staff. So can I have everyone stand up and wave so that everyone can see the people who are behind the National Centre, because it's not just me, there's a whole group of wonderful people running around with microphones doing these fantastic presentations, supporting our fellows and all our researchers and people who need things done in 5 minutes flat. So I have a wonderful team supporting me, and I really do sincerely thank you. And lastly, as we're finishing right on time, I would like to thank all of you collectively for your valuable contributions to today's proceedings. We will be asking for a little bit more feedback and information from you as we get together the communique and send that out. So please feel free to add any other comments. But thank you to the group that's joined us here today for your support and dedication, because we are progressing towards that very strong national narrative, and we all strongly support equity because it matters, and it's because it's transformational for individuals, families and communities. So thank you very much everyone who's here. And finishing right on time, please join us for lunch.
Just before we do finish up though, the 2017 Equity Fellows would like to present you and the National Centre with this, Sue, as a thanks from us to the National Centre, and just to let people know it's meant to represent the research, policy and practice, and also the fourth one is the invisible voice of the people that whose voices we're trying to make more visible in this space.
Oh,
so
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we look forward to getting photos now with that most beautiful piece of artwork. Isn't that gorgeous? Thank you, everyone.